Hello and welcome everyone to the finale of the series Orthodoxy, Autocracy and Nationality concerning the over 2 millennia history of the Greek and Russian worlds, leading up to the failed attempt to reconquer Constantinople and the fall of Moscow to the Bolsheviks. I'm very lucky to be joined again by Marcus Furious-Pertinax. Hello.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, and indeed, as the resident Grecophile on this channel, it is almost sad to be at the conclusion of orthodoxy, autocracy, nationalism. But here we are, and I suppose what bigger send off than to have the last two streams that we have had.
And Rupert, rejoining us from the Stalin series. Hello.
Hello. Very appropriate that I be here as, I suppose, a token Russophile to some degree. Thank you for having me on again.
No, and you told me just before coming on the stream that this was your wheelhouse, so to speak. So hopefully we can all enjoy this rather morbid and depressing topic. But just by way of introduction, obviously last time we entertained this series, we talked about the fall of Greater Greece, the Greco-Turkish 100 Years' War, at least what I termed it. Obviously, that was dealing with the finale of the history in the Balkans and regarding the Greek and Anatolian situation. This episode, therefore, is the geographic continuity of that, focusing on the fall of the Tsar and the fall of all of the attempts to arrest the advance of Bolshevism during the course of the early 20th century. The last time I actually focused on this period in Russian history was a very long time ago, discussing Pobedonostsev and the reflections of a Russian statesman with Mr. Patriarch. And I also had a corresponding solo presentation, which went along the lines of judging the historical relationship between Moscow and St. Petersburg as the spiritual and political capitals of the Russian Empire. Now, the reason I brought this up was anticipating a conversation like this, where at least throughout the course of the 19th century, there was a spiritual move away from St. Petersburg gradually towards Moscow, even though the Tsars themselves wouldn't commit themselves ever to changing the capital. So the idea of the Third Rome, even though Moscow isn't the literal capital of the Tsarist Empire, the Russian Empire from 1721 up until 1917, the idea that the Russian Empire is an extension of the Third Rome, and the Third Rome represents this claim to Roman and Orthodox Christian imperium, never really goes away. And so it is stemming from these previous conversations that we're returning to this topic and terming it the fall of the Third Rome. And I'll get into exactly what is meant by that term in due process. There's another theme I want to get across in this, which is we're not going to be approaching the events of the Russian Revolution and the Great War from the perspective of the Bolsheviks and the left, because not only have I covered that in this article, but obviously this is regarding the fall of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. So discussing the origins of Bolshevism, which I've gone into in various other conversations ad nauseum, really isn't necessary here. We're going to be approaching this from the right. And what I find fascinating in approaching this conversation is when I previously looked at the period from 1881, the ascent of Tsar Alexander III, and 1904, the year of the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, is how confident the Russian right was. Indeed, there was a inextricable association between the temporal and religious authority within Russia, and there was a vehement and ideological anti-parliamentarism. The Russian Empire had been able to resist most of the trends which had taken over Europe, even the quote-unquote more reactionary places like Austria or Prussia, later the German Empire. And nevertheless, from 1904 to 1924, not only do these forces lose traction, they are completely annihilated. So what I really want to understand is how the right in the Tsarist Empire in Russia can not only fail, but fail so utterly and catastrophically from a position of such strength as they found themselves in 1904. But before getting into that, I just want to rehash what is meant by the Third Rome. And I'm reading an excerpt from a previous lecture I gave a very long time ago now. I think it's almost over a year ago, from episode 12, when I was talking about the origins of the Russian Empire. It was during the reign of Grand Prince Yuri, so this would be the first part of the 16th century, that the legend of Moscow as the Third Rome or a Second Constantinople gained serious traction. Already during the final decade of the Byzantine Empire, and also this should provide a nice segue in terms of linking the previous conversation on Greece and bringing this back to why Russia and Greece are linked in this way. Foma of Tver had written the eulogy of the pious and Grand Prince Boris Alexandrovich, indicating that Russia was the Third Rome. With the defeat of Constantine XI, of course, he was the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Orthodox Christianity lost its Basileus. Of course, Basileus was the title afforded to the late Roman emperors and the Byzantine emperors, which was inherited from the Greek, but was associated with that of an Augustus. And Moscow, as the most powerful of the Orthodox principalities, having successfully broken the yoke of the Mongols, was perceived as the natural inheritor of Roman Imperium, alone capable of defeating Muslims and restoring Christian imperial authority to Constantinople. This despite the head of the Orthodox world, Patriarch Gennadius Scholaris, legitimating the rule of Mehmed II as the true successor of Rome. And this, of course, is going back to our previous conversation, directly previous conversation, where we were discussing the demise of the authority of Gennadius' successors, the ecumenical patriarchs, and the demise of the Roman nation to be replaced by the literal process of Balkanization and the rise of a liberal and increasingly secular, though not totally secular Greece. While the marriage of Sophia to Ivan III bolstered that claim further, and of course this is Sophia Palaiologos, who I believe, Marcus, was a granddaughter or a great-granddaughter of John VIII.
Yes, was a granddaughter. That's right. Yes, because I think she was either a cousin or a niece of the last emperor Constantine XI, if I'm not mistaken.
Ivan III partook of no campaign against the Ottomans. To the contrary, the Ottomans were neutral allies to the Muscovites in their more immediate temporal struggle against the Lithuanians. In 1492, Metropolitan Zosimus, in his Pascalian, declared Ivan III as the new Constantine, and Moscow as the new Constantinople. Philioteus took this idea further, based on his own interpretation of the Apocalypse of St. John, and this is reading from the King James Bible. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit, and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wander, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The seventh heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. Verses 9 and 10 are taken to be Rome, which Philiotheus interprets as the fall of the Christian kingdoms, which shall come together in a single kingdom. 2 Romes have fallen, and a third stands. There shall be no fourth. The fall of Constantinople was predetermined as punishment of the Council of Florence, and this is the idea that just before the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the emperors had betrayed their Orthodox scruples and formed a union with Rome. Though again, this interpretation is complicated by Mehmed II's empowering of Scholaris Gennadius and the anti-union faction of Orthodox clerics in Constantinople. Of course, the idea that the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople was very happy to go along with Mehmed II because he ensured that the Orthodox Church would retain its separate status from Rome. The rhetoric of the Muscovite clerics then turned on the patriarch in Constantinople, claiming that Moscow, as the seat of an Orthodox emperor, was the appropriate seat of the patriarch. The Palaiologos descent, while conducive to the imperial claim, in and of itself was weak, since Andreas, Sophia's brother, and heir to Thomas and Constantine XI, had sold his rights to their most Catholic majesties of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. If one is to take inherited succession as a given, a principle established in Western monarchies, yet never in Rome. As Mehmed and all subsequent Ottoman rulers were Muslims and thus heathens, all Holy Roman emperors were Catholics and thus heretics. Orthodoxy was thus placed at the center of the Third Rome mythology, a teleology commencing not with Ivan III and Sophia Poliologos, but with Vladimir the Great and Anna Porphyrogenitor. And of course, that was the original union which aided in the Christianization of Rus pre-Russia in the, I believe, the beginning of the 11th century. So there's this idea that Muscovy and later Russia is not only a nation, but it is a nation founded on the idea of a theological mission. It must hold the entire Christian world, and by that the Orthodox world, together, because everything else has fallen to heresy or the infidels in the case of Constantinople. So it is imperative for the state of, you can say, all temporal spiritual existence under heaven, that orthodoxy be retained and retained under the headship of Muscovy. And this is where I come back to the idea of a Muscovite commonwealth, or the Orthodox Commonwealth, and Russia as its head, inheriting that mantle from 1453, albeit with more dubious appellations, you can say. There is definitely an intellectual movement which is gaining strength, and by the coronation of Tsar Ivan IV in, if I remember correctly, 1547, by the Metropolitan Macarius, the idea of a Third Rome is made explicit when the Prince of Moscow is elevated from that of a mere Grand Prince or leader of the Rus into the idea of a Tsar, a Caesar, assuming that imperial mantle. Of course, this is then later complicated by the fact you have various schisms within Russia. So, for example, in the 17th century, you have Tsar Alexis, and you have the Nikon reforms, which creates a division within the Orthodox community in Russia between those who go along with the Greek reforms and those who reject them as the old believers. This schism is made even more explicit on less religious but more on political grounds when Tsar Peter the Great decides not only to distance himself from this idea of the Third Rome, but to move the capital to St. Petersburg, his new city, and to abolish the Muscovite Patriarchate. The Patriarchate would only come into existence after the death of Ivan IV, but nevertheless, the whole idea of Russia or Moscow as being the seat of a Patriarchate gives some credence, legitimacy to this idea that Muscovy, Russia, is indeed the Third Rome. So not only does the moving of the capital entail moving away out of the Third Rome, but it also involves a radical reformation of the Church in the process of creating the position of the procurator of the Holy Synod, which was supposed to reflect the secular government as well. So when I came back to this discussion about the contrast between Moscow and St. Petersburg, after the death of Alexander II, and you see the rise of Russian reaction in the sense of looking back to the reign of Ivan IV for inspiration. When you look at the Manifesto of Unshakable Autocracy, for example, it is very much based on the coronation oath given by Ivan IV. And of course, this is linked also with the anti-parliamentarism of Pobedonostsev and the idea of the people of Russia being wedded to the Tsar as the little father, and the idea, of course, that the little father was the vice-regent of Christ. In other words, these terms, which would be written off by some people as medieval, were integral to the idea of the Tsar as the ruler of the Russian people. And more you can see, even though that Moscow is not technically the capital of the Russian Empire, this mythic symbolism of the Third Rome has extended to the mission of the entire Russian Empire. And of course, Nicholas II definitely believed this himself and believed it was his mission to lead a spiritual resurgence, not within Russia itself, but also within the world, as he was, of course, the leader of this Orthodox Commonwealth. I think it only sort of appropriate, in a sense, to end this conversation regarding biblical quotations and linking this idea of Russia as it existed in the beginning of the 20th century back to the idea of the Third Rome by talking about what happened in 1917 with the revelations of Fatima in Portugal. Of course, this is a Marian apparition taking place in a Catholic country, But around 1941, the various secrets or revelations made to a bunch of children in Portugal were made public, and this is the second secret of Fatima, which was again relayed in 1917. You have seen hell where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. If what I say if what I say to you is done, many souls will be saved, and there will be peace. The war is going to end, by this, of course, meaning the First World War. But if people do not cease offending God, a worse one will break out during the pontificate of Pope Pius XI. When you see a night illuminated by an unknown light, know that this is the great sign given you by God that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by the means of war, famine, and persecutions of the Church and the Holy Father. To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart and the communion of reparation on the first Saturdays, if my requests are heeded. Russia will be converted, and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, causing wars, persecutions to the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Various nations will be annihilated. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. So, interestingly, linking back to this idea of Russian exceptionalism and Russia as the Orthodox bastion, taken from a strictly Catholic point of view, of course, consecrated to the Immaculate Heart would also mean healing the schism between East and West and making Orthodoxy and Catholicism inseparable, one and the same. But reading this from an Orthodox perspective, it's interesting to consider that the wars, the famine, and the persecutions to be visited not only on Russia, but the world, and the idea of the annihilation of nations seems very appropriate in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution and the horrors that are going to be visited on Russia, and praying that one day Russia will return to the fold of Christian nations, as ultimately it has done tentatively since the fall of communism in 1991. So I think in terms of basing this idea on an eschatological vision regarding the end of the world and all of the ruin that would fall from the fall of the Third Rome, I think it only appropriate looking back to 1917 as the year, of course, of the Fatima revelations. Before I get into a series of articles which I have planned for this evening, do any of you have anything to comment on anything I brought up so far?
Not with detail. For myself personally, I'm sure Rupert might chime in with something a bit more sizable. But from the standpoint of, from the religious standpoint, and you mentioned Fatima, sort of there in the revelation that the sisters have in Portugal, this fate that would befall, like you say, not just Russia or the Russian people, but the world writ large, is interesting insofar that it occurs in the aftermath of World War One, which in the contemporaneous sense is called the Great War. It's how it is referred to until obviously World War Two occurs a couple of decades later. But there's almost two sort of maxims isn't the right word, but points of reference maybe is what I can use. And one is that old phrase about whilst Rome stands, the world stands, and when Rome falls, the world will fall. And that you have this loss of Constantinople in the south. You might say the final loss with the culmination of the Greco-Turkish War of in 1922-23, and then with the disintegration of Russia, the Russian state, and then the Bolshevik revolution that occurs thereafter, the third and last Rome is lost. And that idea that even though there is more than one actual Rome, there's in fact sort of three in the historical context. The other, the second and third are both lost, funnily enough, within, a few months of each other, or rather a couple of years of each other. And that thought comes to mind. And the second one is this idea of, if we keep sinning, ill will occur to us. I can't but help think, because we're talking about Russia here, and obviously there's certain parts of the story that have certainly accounted for Russia's eastern neighbors, and I can't help but think of the notion of the Mongols, the hordes that come off the steppe, and the idea that your God has sent me, for your people have sinned so much. And it's almost like this prophetic notion that this is actually happening to the Russians themselves, and that the ills of mankind are coming to pay themselves multiple fold.
But just to bolster that, I mean, when looking at the Soviets in particular, didn't Tamerlane make the same prophecy regarding the disturbing of his tomb, which would have been in Soviet Uzbekistan in 1941? And of course, that was the visitation of Hitler on the Soviets. So all of these interesting
Matter of days
historical
later.
parallels, matter of days later, which is interesting enough. But Rupert, anything you would like to say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a curious environment that all this takes place in, especially with the religious angle. Because, of course, as I understand it, Wilhelm II over in Germany has a sort of similar religious experience over the course of the war, and sort of retreats more into, well, that's certainly the line that's trotted out by the military sort of government, that he's sort of retreating into a religious or mystic stupor. But my sense is there is a bit of truth to that. But that's even more true in the Russian case, because through a lot of the Russian propaganda and a lot of the Russian writings, the justification for the war is against sort of like the godless world. So it's sort of like Russian spiritualism and Russian mysticism and spiritual goodness and wholeness that is contrasted against the sort of rationality and the atheistic cynicism of and the Nietzscheanism of Germany. Notwithstanding the contradiction of allying with France, but that's another matter. But on top of that, the fact that Moscow is, as you said, sort of like the spiritual heartland. I can't, or the spiritual capital. I can't help but wonder if the fact that Moscow was not restored as the capital, and sort of like that opportunity was left to the Bolsheviks, sort of like led to some amount of like, symbolic benefit at the very least for the Bolsheviks, because they're then able to portray themselves as like the older, even if they're not explicitly saying it, they can portray themselves as the older, like more authentic, less sort of Europeanized or Westernized version of Russia that is kind of like embracing the old.
I mean, we're looking at this purely spiritual terms. Again, you can see that the fall of the Romanovs and the empire was inextricably linked to the fall of St. Petersburg. And so in that sense, you can say the cleansing of Russia from the Romanovs was in many ways representative of some sort of 20th century Gomorrah, if you're going to look at this in terms of the religious symbolism. But this will be a good time to come back to, I would say, the many failures of Tsar Nicholas II. I mean, it's interesting you discussing the post hoc rationalization for Tsar Nicholas II getting to the war, and you do mention the fact that he was allied with the secular, atheistic French Third Republic and the liberal, moneyed British Empire against the two other Christian emperors in Europe, which is interesting to consider. Just by way of introduction, of course, I ended the conversation last time talking about Russia and the Russian Empire at its height. Following the disaster of the Crimean War, Russia was able to reform and consolidate. I would even argue, and I have argued, that acts such as the Great Emancipation were to the benefit of autocracy and not to the detriment. When looking at this map, of course, the Russian Empire in 1904 spread from Poland to Vladivostok. At times, it controlled Alaska. There was also that's a rather interesting interpretation. It was certainly secularist, especially after 1905. But also we have spheres of influence in northern Iran, in Manchuria. This also map indicates the loss of South Sakhalin, which is following from the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. I'm not really going to be discussing that war in length, but rather the repercussions of it, because I had hoped at one point to segue into this topic as its own stream regarding the Russo-Japanese War, but I feel it doesn't really fit thematically into the rest of it, so that'll have to be an episode of Heterodox, I'm afraid. But I have here an article. All of these articles are linked. They're cited in the description. The Monarchists Against Their Monarch, the Rightist Criticism of Tsar Nicholas II by PODBOLOTOV. And this will provide the basis for us discussing the reign of Nicholas II and the ultimate disaster that befalls the Romanovs. In turbulent 1905, when the revolution shook the traditional pillars of the Russian autocracy, that of course is the revolution of 1905, which stemmed from the disasters of the Russo-Japanese War in part, Nicholas II called his loyal subjects to rally around the throne and to help in the struggle with the rebels. Those responded formed the Right movement. It turned out to be extremely divergent. The ideas to save the autocracy as a Russian national foundation attracted old-fashioned intellectuals, Slavophiles and high-ranked bureaucrats, peasants seeking patronage of the Tsar, and rich gentry nationalistic populists and police officers. The Union of Russian People, the SRN, headed by A.I. Dobrovin, became the main party of the extreme rightists, or the Black Hundreds. It suffered two major splits, and as a result, somewhat less extreme parties, the Union of the Archangel Michael, the SMA, of Purushkevich, and the renovated SRN of N.E. Markov came into being. The major party of the moderate right wing, the All-Russian National Union, where Shulgin became the most remarkable figure, emerged in the Third Duma period to support the Stolypin and his reforms, and of course to go back over the history, of course. In 1905, there is a manifesto given to reform the empire by Tsar Nicholas. In 1906, we see the creation of the fundamental laws of the Russian Empire, which, even though explicit mention is made to the preservation of the autocracy, these are tempered by constitutional reforms, which created the first Russian state Duma. Of course, the Tsar had to tweak with the various Dumas in order to create a parliamentary backing which would be amenable to him. The first Duma failed. The second Duma elected Bolsheviks and Social Democrats. And it's only with Stolypin's political reforms, constitutional reforms, that a couple of years after the creation of the fundamental laws of the Russian Empire, is there some form of peace between the new legislature of the Russian Empire and the Tsar, something that Pobedonostsev had predicted when he made his criticisms of parliamentarianism in Russia and what would essentially be seen as anathema to the system and the relationship between the Tsar and the people, as opposed to working through these middlemen or these elected representatives as the right saw them. Traditional Slavophiles like Lev Tikhomirov or General Alexander Kireyev hated party politics and preferred to stay out of the party organizations. Yet they clearly belonged to the same political camp as convinced monarchists who were strongly opposed to constitutionalism and were sympathetic to the right. Despite their divergent backgrounds and views, many rightists from various groups displayed one surprisingly common feature, which historians have almost completely overlooked when we will discuss hidden or open criticism of Tsar Nicholas II. In accordance with the main party doctrine of autocracy, this emphasized declaration of loyalty and faithfulness to Nicholas II was the distinguishing mark of the right. They sprinkled their numerous petitions to the Tsar with expressions of truly faithful feelings in the name of the people. Deputations of the supporters of autocracy presented themselves to Nicholas II. The right wing declared war on all genuine and imagined enemies of the Tsar. Among the extreme rightists, the cult of the autocrat took on excessive and often pseudo-religious forms. The Tsar was compared with the sun that warmed the just and the guilty. He was called our only support at present and our brightest happiness in the future. And again, within the Russian context, it should be noted that the association between the sovereign and the idea of Christ's vice-regency is even stronger when associated with the Tsar. In fact, it's not simply that the Tsar is representative of Christ, but the Tsar is almost Christ's surrogate in many ways, beyond simply acting in his name, which is why when we see usurpation is a spiritual ill, which is often heralded in association with the rise of the Antichrist. Obviously, as I continue through this article, either of you can comment, but just thus far, do either of you have anything to say?
Yeah, for one thing, this isn't so there's an interpretation of this in isolation that sort of says that with the sort of splintering of the right, I mean, we haven't fully got there yet, but the mobilization of rightist elements, to oppose other sort of elements that are operating in society in opposition to the Tsar. This isn't something that's without precedent. And in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Alexander II, there was a similar movement that was started up, albeit a lot more in the vein of a secret society. But, at a certain level, there's not that much divide between the two.
Well, I think what is noteworthy about this, because all political systems, even though they claim to stand above politics, all temporal systems are political. So secret societies, whatever, the actions of individual generals, priests, managers, whatever, are always going to have a significant impact. I mean, I've gone over the impact of various secret societies retaining to Russia in particular, but what is significant about the right, as is referred to post-1905, is the association with political parties and parliamentary mandates, which didn't really exist at all before, because Russia has embarked upon this experiment with constitutional monarchy, one which vast members of the right aren't particularly happy with, which is the whole consensus. Again, I'm put in mind of what happened in France after the demise of Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbons, the idea that we are elected to this chamber, but we do not recognize this chamber. Invariably, even though we are creating political associations, they are only representative of the political situation we find ourselves in, and our goal is essentially to abolish them. That is what I think is the fundamental distinguishing factor here in terms of the broad sweep of the history of Tsarist Russia.
It is, but just the point that I was going to make is that in the past, this is a movement which had been sort of successfully wound down again once it was no longer required. Whereas, obviously that doesn't necessarily happen in this second case. But I like to try to emphasize the points at which things might have gone a little differently, with minor changes in the timeline. I know we're not doing alternate history here, but
all hopes were pinned only on him. His words on autocracy were the motto of the movement. Tsarist portraits were venerated like holy relics. And again, it should be mentioned again, this idea of the association with temporal authority and spiritual authority. Unlike what we see in the West, in Russia, authority is explicitly Caesaro-Papist. In other words, the patriarch, or at this point, the procurator of the Holy Synod, and the Synod and the Russian Church in general are subordinate to the Tsar, as opposed in Catholic countries, or indeed with Protestant countries, where religious authority, and in the case of the Catholics, of course, the Pope stands above various leaders in terms of religious authority. But when you look at, say, for example, the Anglican Church, you can't honestly say that the English monarch at this point is some sort of representative of Christ's rule on earth, as religion becomes increasingly irrelevant in that country. But anyway. However, the other side of this coin, of this monarchist movement, was its target in the circumstances of the worsening crises of autocracy, could be Nicholas II himself. This movement considered that the autocratic order was the most ideal for the country, but reality testified appallingly to this national crisis. Correspondingly, responsibility for such a state of political affairs had to lie inevitably, not with objective shortcomings of the system, but rather with the character of the reigning Tsar himself. And again, I find this actually rather interesting, because if people are familiar with my own sort of work on the modern monarchy in England, I know this isn't strictly related to this topic, but it is thematically. Again, the idea of ultra-royalist, plus royaliste que le roi, the idea that one has to be more royalist than the king, or in this case, the Tsar, essentially, and that is a matter of these political agitators bringing the Tsar or the sovereign into consistency with the views of those ostensibly desirous of upholding pristine royalist values, or in this case, Tsarist values. The method of pointing out scapegoats, Jews, students, bureaucrats, was suitable for public propaganda, especially among the lower classes. By contrast, in private conversations with the right-wing elite, Nicholas II himself was subject to sharp and often well-grounded accusations. Disseminating critical views of the Tsar could be risky because of the police repression. However, to have one's personal opinion in Tsarist Russia, unlike the Soviet Union, was not too dangerous.
If I may, though, quickly, it is worth noting that some amount of this criticism is not necessarily entirely well-founded, I would say, if only because the Tsar himself was quite well aware of a lot of these issues as well. So it's not entirely conspiratorial, and the Tsar himself was involved in the monitoring of them by sort of personally overseeing the activities of the Okhrana and sort of emphasizing at different points which groups they should be sort of keeping a close eye on, and he was always very well kept up to date with the various happenings.
For revolutionaries, it was not particularly important who was sitting on the throne. From their point of view, the Russian system was by definition headed by a tyrant, an oppressor of the people, a grand reactionary landlord. By contrast, the emperor as an individual played an enormously important role in the eyes of the monarchists. The main quality of the ideal autocrat was thought to be a clear, consistent, resolute will, which forced subjects to follow the political course defined from above, and was insusceptible to passing political influences and selfish interests. Only then could one speak of an autocracy as a political practice. Nicholas II, because of his personal qualities, was completely unsuitable for this idea of monarchical rule. The objective circumstances of the epoch, which prevented Nicholas II from reigning autocratically, were not really taken into account by the conservatives. Kireev, knowing well the ruling elite, sounded the alarm already in the early years of the reign of the last Tsar. The country is heading towards a constitution, the general foresaw in 1900. Our Polizei-Staat, our state police, is becoming more and more impossible. It is also a political position. It is bearable when in the hands of a Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great, but not when the monarchy is divided among ministers, when it is divided into small change. The inability of Nicholas II to control the ministers was clear to Kireev. There is no government. There are ministers who in their meetings with the Tsar can achieve all they want to, uncontrollable. Under Nicholas II, Kireev wrote in his diary, the contrary was an absurd situation, the worst imaginable. There is autocracy, but no autocrat. It was intolerable for a true monarchist. What a situation. We are ruled by a pedestrat and a magician, a Metrevsky and a Misar. And again, I'm just sort of,
Also worth noting briefly that I've seen just as often Nicholas II be accused of far too much micromanagement and not placing enough trust in his various appointees. And I think that was one of the justifications for various groups like industrialists and some bureaucrats, some senior bureaucrats supporting the idea of his abdication, because he was seen to be taking too much of an active part. I don't know. I see a lot of scapegoating and a lot of comparison with an ideal that never really perhaps existed.
Well, I mean, in terms of the most obvious example where this existed to me, because I do believe this is actually an accurate portrayal, was in his desire to flip allegiances during the height of the Russo-Japanese War as a result of his conference with Kaiser Wilhelm II in Sweden at Björkö, where he had essentially the plan of Kaiser Wilhelm II was to ally with Russia and by extension compel France into a neutered position vis-a-vis Germany. He didn't want to end the alliance between Russia and France. He simply wanted to neuter hostility between Germany and France using Russia as a proxy. And he also believed, because of Britain's actions through their ally, Japan, I do believe Britain was essentially, if anything, at war with Russia during this time, especially when we look at instances with the Dogger Bank. The Tsar had an opportunity to, you can say, prevent a situation like World War I, and instead he fell completely prey to the views of ministers who told him to forget that the document ever happened. In terms of what I would say is, in fairness to your comment regarding micromanagement, that tends to be associated with his role as leader at Stavka, the military headquarters, where he was involved in the daily runnings of the military and the personal operations regarding appointments and command posts, etc. But of course, this also corresponds to the fact that he was actually politically isolated, whilst at the same time he was quote unquote micromanaging. So I think all of these things within a certain context to actually sort of give the impression that whilst, yes, there is a lot of evidence regarding the fact that we have an autocrat which is controlled by his ministers, and yet in other respects we look at the relationship between the Tsarista and Rasputin as an example of a completely isolated and you can say, aloof autocracy, which isn't beholden to anything at all, including ministerial oversight. So there are lots of sort of twists and turns regarding this, and it's not helpful to prescribe one outlook to this, because the Tsar definitely wasn't controlled by a cabinet in 1916, for example. Monarchist attempts to influence Nicholas II ran into the Tsar's apparent lack of initiative and indifference, attributes totally unsuitable for an autocrat, and this is a very consistent trend you see, especially coming from Alexandra herself, the Empress, when she essentially orders Nicholas II to have the volition of Peter the Great to be Ivan the Terrible. The famous priest, John of Kronstadt, who sympathized with the right, entered a very indicative prayer in his diary. May the sleeping Tsar awaken, who has not wielded his authority. So it was clear that by the whim of fate, an inappropriate figure was occupying the position of emperor. There was talk of a palace coup among high-ranked officials. However, there was no appropriate replacement for the current Tsar. Mikhail Alexandrovich, according to Kirev, was a marvelous moral, but not bright, and most importantly, had no desire to reign. And this is a point I want to come back to in 1917, because I believe it's pivotal. Just as with his reigning older brother, Mikhail did not have qualities necessary for an autocrat: individual initiative, will. Bolodnovchia, a wife of a devoted popularizer of monarchy among the lower classes, Bogdanovich, and a host of St. Petersburg aristocratic salons, had an even lower opinion of Mikhail. Weak-willed, of limited intelligence, in the hands of a Jewess, Fulfa, and like the young Tsarina, terrible for Russia, of course, the Tsarina referring, of course, to Alexandra. The first and second princes, Vladimiroviches, are both interverate, good-for-nothings. Kirev similarly considered other possible pretenders to the throne among the Romanovs. It is not surprising that after the defeats of the Russo-Japanese War, arising from, as Kirev put it, the Tsar's childish desire to conquer Manchuria, and again, I don't agree with that at all, but I nevertheless believe that the Tsar bungled into the conflict by not establishing a clear position on Korea. The start of the revolution, criticism of the unsuccessful ruler strengthened. Among the sharper critics were Nikolsky, who became one of the leaders of the SRN, who had a personal audience with the emperor, had made an extremely positive impression on Nicholas II for his thoughts about the necessity of the autocracy of Russia. So this, again, is something to consistently point out, is that even though the Tsar was criticized from the right for lacking will, so to speak, when one has to look at Nicholas II himself, he was very much following in the line established by his father, and by that of his tutor, the procurator of the Holy Synod, Pobedonostsev, in that he was devoted to the idea of the autocracy. And he saw it as his duty, not only to Russia, but also to his heir, the Tsarevich Alexis, to continue in this vein of maintaining the Russian autocracy. When, as you look to, say, for example, the French equivalent with Louis XVIII, Louis XVIII began his reign by signaling a constitutional charter, whereas in this case, Nicholas II had that charter forced upon him, and he tried to erode it and effectively de facto abolished it by 1916.
Well, the problem is that it still came with a load of baggage that ended up coming back to bite him later.
Absolutely.
In particular, the immunity, I believe it was, like a kind of legal immunity.
Sovereign immunity regarding the assassination of Rasputin. Is that what you're referring to?
No, the who was it? The Guchkov coup that was being organized and and that the Okhrana were aware of, but couldn't intervene to do anything to stop it because, well, for two reasons. All of the members had Duma immunity, and it was also being organized in the British Embassy.
That should tell you everything, shouldn't it? However, secretly from the Tsar, he was also thinking that under this autocrat, to be a conservative, one had to be radical and even revolutionary. His diary confirms that he was ready to go far. Let you in on a secret. I think that it is naturally impossible to bring the Tsar to his senses. He is worse than inept. He is, God forgive me, a total nobody. If so, then his reign will not be redeemed before long. O Lord, do we really deserve that our faith was so in vain? One assassination is now too little to clear in the air. We need something Serbian, and of course, by Serbian, we're talking about the May regicide of Alexander I that eliminated the Obrenović dynasty and replaced them with the Karađorđević. In a conversation with the Bogdanoviches, when discussing the catastrophic defeat at the Tsushima Straits, of course, the colossal naval disaster during the Russo-Japanese War, Nikolaevsky argued that it was of necessity to change the dynasty, since it was impossible to bring that stupid, inept, ignorant, pathetic person, the reigning emperor, to his senses. Yet if it were possible to hope for his suicide, that would be a chance. But he will never be able to do it. Tikhomirov believed that with such a Tsar as Nicholas, the autocratic course was doomed. Reading the reports about the Tsarist receptions, Tikhomirov concluded that the sovereign was extremely inconsistent. To some deputations, the Tsar said one thing, to some others, something surprisingly different. The Tsar's liberal steps made early in the revolution to pacify the opposition brought out extreme bewilderment among the right-wing extremists. And again, this has to be put in a context of saying that he was under the influence of liberal ministers such as Sergei Witte, but more importantly, this could be seen as a pragmatic political move to assuage the feelings of anti-Tsarism that were running rampant in the capital. In the same way, for example, if I were to bring in an English comparison of Richard II promising concessions to the peasants, and then with their leadership essentially out of the picture with the death of Wat Tyler, going around and repressing them with impunity. Marcus, I'm very conscious of the fact that you haven't said anything for quite a long time. So do you have anything you would like to say?
No. Rupert sort of covered a few points. I'm sort of a bit of a passenger here. So no, I've got nothing to add.
Some said that with the Ukaz, the Edict of April the 17th, 1905 on religious freedom, Nicholas II had betrayed orthodoxy. The extreme rightists could never reconcile themselves to the manifesto of October the 17th, which limited the autocracy. Hans Roger especially noted the persistent rumors that rightists hated Nicholas II more than the left wanted to get rid of him. However, this kind of plan did not develop into a further conversation. After the October Manifesto, an epoch of public politics began, and a wide mass, or as the conservative elite arrogantly put it, the street, was drawn into the rightist movement. Public debate within parties on the figure of the ruling Tsar, similar to those in private, like that of Nikolsky in the salon of Bogdanovich, or in the circulation of critical notes left by conservatives in their diaries, were not permissible. The popular propaganda of the right parties never personally attacked Nicholas II. This was a serious taboo. And again, the whole idea consistent among monarchists, the idea that the monarch himself is not to blame, it is always the evil advisors around the monarch. This was a serious taboo, not merely stimulated by fear of police repression. Orthodox monarchical doctrine emphasized that the Tsar's mistakes would not be smoothed over by the trust and obedience of the people. If the people obey, then even if the Tsar makes a mistake, then this is nothing particularly bad, wrote Tikhomirov. The autocrat was to be infallible in the eyes of the people, even if this contradicted reality. Otherwise, a mutiny might result. The program of the Russkoye Sobranie especially highlighted this. The autocratic Tsar is not identical with the government in the eyes of his people, and the government is responsible for any policy harmful to autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, and the Russian people. In this way, the bureaucracy and various internal and external enemies were to pay for the mistakes. Again, the idea of the evil advisor. However, sometimes the extremist, or as they were sometimes called, right-wing revolutionaries, with their disobedient populist rhetoric, could cast even the sovereign in a negative light. As an activist of the OREL SRN cell, Krasnikov published the populist brochure For the Faith, the Tsar and the Fatherland, in which he claimed that in 1905, the Tsar father was fully in the hands of the powerful, impudent beast who imprisoned the Tsar and forced him to sign his satanic fabrications, including the manifesto of October the 17th. By impudent beast, cunning official, and Jewish agents, Krasnikov was, of course, referring to Count Sergei Witte, while the feeble-minded Tsar was naturally Nicholas II. The brochure was confiscated as anti-government propaganda, and the authorities initiated a criminal prosecution. Like many genuine revolutionaries, Krasnolnikov went into hiding and stayed concealed until 1909, when he was arrested in his native city of Orel and finally imprisoned. There was another reason why Black Hundred's attacks against the government could backfire. The authority of the state was not embodied by bureaucrats alone, but primarily by Nicholas II. The failure of the authorities' prestige undermined the position of the monarch, and hence the position of the monarchists too, and strengthened political opposition to the latter. In this sense, the autocrat and the parties of the supporters of autocracy were bound by an enduring thread. This is why right-wingers considered the political innocence of Nicholas II were distressed and felt under such an indifferent monarch, the monarchists would play an insignificant role. The right-wing Kievan professor Kulikovsky wrote to his colleague Sobolevsky in Moscow in a spirit of a typically Russian helpless gloom, "I have no hope for the Russian monarchist parties. To have power, they need a genuine monarch, but we have instead a kind of miserable blancmange. In Tsarist Russia, monarchist parties were in extremely ambiguous, clumsy, and contradictory position. While calling for obedience to each word of the autocrat and pretending to show to an all example of loyalty and humble obedience, party activists on the right struggled to play the role of independent politicians, trying to underscore their independence and even critical attitude towards the government and local authorities. Although the monarch was the head of state, possessing enormous power, the ideology of the Black Hundred movement continued a sharp dissatisfaction with political reality. The Tsarist regime always thought that it was better to keep people out of politics, in full contradiction of this fundamental tradition of autocratic administration. New wave autocratic apologists widely appealed to the people to join the ranks of their political parties. Finally, the nationalist foundation of right-wing politics could hardly be a factor in conservative restraint in Imperial Russia, insofar as it not only aroused much inter-ethnic friction, but also called for a critical review of the entire past imperial practice. The idea of the SRN pogrom, that Russian sovereigns beginning with Peter I, although they continue to call themselves autocrats, but this autocracy already was not Orthodox Russian, but rather closer to something like Western European absolutism, cast a shadow of suspicion across all the predecessors of Nicholas II, beginning from the 18th century, if not put onto him too. Again, this idea of St. Petersburg being in some way representative of other than the Third Moscow in this sense, and this has essentially been a curse laid on the Romanov dynasty by, you could almost say, an act of pseudo-apostasy when Peter the Great decided to move the capital and style the capital, and by extension the Russian Empire, on that, say, for example, of a European monarchy resembling that of absolutist France or Prussia. Before I move on again, do either of you have anything you would like to say?
If I may just ask something briefly, is this to say that, or to suggest that of the two cities, that Moscow vis-a-vis St. Petersburg was more representative and more a reflection of Russia and Russian culture and Russian ideals than the capital that is built by Peter the Great? Is that what that is trying to get across?
Yes, yes, essentially the idea. I mean, even going back to the idea of the Third Rome, when we look at various military parades going back to the reign of Nicholas I, and we look at the coronation rituals in the Dormition Cathedral and the construction, say, for example, of the Grand Kremlin Palace, there is always this association that Moscow is the other capital. You can say in a way that there is a trend, again, going back to French history, when one looks at Versailles, and one looks at Versailles as the king's capital. And so part of the revolution, part of the process of nationalizing the king to make the king a king of the French again, is to remove him from Versailles and bring him back to Paris. However, in the case of this system, we're talking about there being a reactionary impetus that would bring him from St. Petersburg to Moscow, because of course Versailles does not have these associations with the window on the west and modernism, liberalism, Western values, which is attributed to having the capital at St. Petersburg.
The point you make about Versailles, though, I mean, just sorry to come across if I sound ignorant here, but Versailles may have been a place where the French royalty resided, but ultimately Paris was still the functional and administrative
Well,
capital.
no, but you have to
France, right?
you have to sort of understand though that when we don't talk about governments in the same way, even though we're talking about absolutist governments, which are the basis of cameralism or managerial sort of political science, we're talking about governments which are tiny in terms of the scale of what we're used to in terms of government. We're talking about
Royal
hundreds
court
of
of sorts. And,
yes, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of government
Mm.
officials versus tens of thousands, if not millions, of government officials today.
Yes.
The practice of administration in the 17th century and indeed the 18th and to some extent even the 19th century was personal. I mean, even if you look at the predecessor organization to the Okhrana, I believe it only had something like 30 full staff members or something. These are incredibly sort of minuscule operations by the standards of the modern state, which is in many ways totalitarian in terms of its overall reach. Whereas looking at the court politics of Versailles, it was possible to manage the nation from the court. Indeed, Versailles wasn't so much a palace so much as it was a political institution, and that's why it became so important that if the king of France were in Versailles, he was not shackled by his people, so to speak. So he needed to be brought to Paris because that process also made Paris the capital of France once more. So I do believe there are parallels, albeit the political situation is effectively reversed, with St. Petersburg representing the revolution and the West, and Moscow representing a return to the Third Rome.
Well, it's funny you you say that about Paris and Versailles, so I won't use that example. But what I was going to say here about, or what I was going to say prior to that point, was that in the case of Russia and this idea of Peter the Great wanting to build a new capital at St. Petersburg that is modeled in this sort of Western way, because obviously he's very famously very much a Francophile himself, is that you look at the peer powers of Russia, throughout this time period, and London is the center of sort of the English realm, and then later the British realm, and sort of London was the capital, has remained the capital, is still the capital today. The same can be said of Austria and the Habsburg Empire. That sort of the power of the Habsburg monarchy concentrated itself around Vienna, and Vienna remained the capital of the Habsburg Austrian Empire up until 1919, I suppose. And I was going to say Paris, but obviously that's a little bit different. And once Prussia coalesced itself around sort of building up Berlin. Berlin was and remained the center of German power and German administration, and that it's sort of peculiar that the Russian state attempts to build this new capital. In some ways, as much as the Third Rome, it actually attempts to echo Rome insofar that the First Rome migrated itself to Constantinople under the will of Constantine. Peter tries to build himself a new capital in the way that Constantine does.
However, though, with Constantine, it was the foundation of a Christian capital. Even though there was a pagan Greek colony that existed there before, much of it had been destroyed, I believe, during the reign of Septimus Severus. And when coming back to this, it is the idea that one is moving away from Christian capital, one is moving away from the Third Rome, and one is founding a secular capital, which I believe is this damning association. But I'll continue on if that's all right.
No, of course. No, I just thought that comparison was interesting, that we should pursue it. But no, you've answered my question, so that's fine.
Well, one other thing quickly, which I don't think is covered in the article, but is relevant, especially in terms of the right, because the right is, especially when it gets to the war, very nationalistic, as can be sort of seen already. And the association with Germanness, which was a deliberate project in St. Petersburg, does become a problem. And it becomes a problem with the Tsar personally to some extent, but even more so his wife, who was at various times considered to be a German agent, basically, who was deliberately sabotaging the empire.
Yes, there was a process to take the German St. Petersburg and nationalize it as the Russified Petrograd, just to clarify that.
Indeed.
In particular, many rightists were critical towards past emperors' nationality policies. And I need to point out that the Russian emperors never had a consistent nationality policy. People have accused various Tsars of being Slavophiles, even though Slavophile isn't a strict appellation, Pan-Slavic, although that isn't a strict appellation either, albeit it's clearer than Slavophile. And of course, the idea that to be a nationality was simply to be loyal to the Tsar, which of course almost is like the right-wing version of civic nationalism. The idea of nationalism was never coherent in terms of a consistent ideology. So this isn't something that can be consistent with Nicholas II, albeit in a very limited context. This would be Russian nationalism directed against the extremities within the Russian Empire, everything from Catholic Poles to Muslim Tatars to Jews, of course.
One other thing, though, is that this problem does go further back than Tsar Nicholas as well. It's sort of a historical conspiracy theory, but there's another figure on the right who's a little bit earlier than all this. I think he dies in the 1880s or 1890s. One Mikhail Skobelev, and he was known as a very he was quite loyalist and very right wing, but in some ways he was again further to the right than the actual Tsars themselves. Because I think his belief was that the Tsars weren't doing enough to sort of like Russify or prop up the Russian people as a nation, and so one conspiracy theory goes that he was actually assassinated for being essentially too far to the right on specifically the national question.
Yes, but just to clarify this as well, that it's not really until the reign of Alexander II that you have a conscious attempt to Russify the political system. In the reign of Nicholas I, who's often mischaracterized as the most reactionary Tsar, this was all rather nebulous. But with the advent of German nationalism and German unification, and with the disaster of the Crimean War, Russification becomes part of the process of national consolidation, as does the Great Emancipation. The only exception to this, really, in terms of the Russification policies, is Finland. And that's only because the Finns were at various times loyal to the Tsar, and because the Tsar was using Finnish nationalism to pit them against Swedish fraternalism, which of course Finland had been part of Sweden before. So we discussed this quite a lot in previous episodes regarding the changing face of Russian nationalism, and I cover it quite extensively when talking about the Crimean War. So if people want to find out more about this and how this cannot be attributed to Nicholas II solely, please look back at those previous episodes. In particular, many rightists were critical towards past emperors' nationality policies, which in their opinion had led to the current crisis in the empire. For example, Markov came forward as the right-wing orator on the Finnish question. He noted a fact truly unique in the history of imperial policy when Alexander I granted Finland a constitution, and quite liberal at the time. Considering his very native Russian subjects were still slaves, his Russian people were sold in bazaars, he's referring of course to serfs, and under Alexander the Liberator, authorities acted, according to Markov, in the service of Finnish longings. For this disrespect to imperial authority, the monarchists should have lost the right to speak, as Pavel Milyakov could not fail to notice, believing that the speaker, Markov, insolently accused the sovereign, Alexander I and Alexander II. Markov's economic analysis supporting the conclusion that to this very day Finland lives entirely on Russian money, on the means of the Russian people, was already a slight to the reigning sovereign. Purushkevich also critically inclined to a history of contemporary condition of the Finnish question, gave a clumsy explanation of the concessions given by Nicholas II to the Finnish constitution in the manifesto of October the 22nd, 1905. Nicholas II, following the logic of Purushkevich, signed the document because of his naivete, if not insanity, insofar as this manifesto was slipped under and given to him, and no one could advise the Tsar not to issue the manifesto, as the imperial government knew nothing about its existence. Despite Purushkevich's best efforts, his criticism still had a rather provocative character. The conservative wing of the right never overcame one fundamental contradiction between 2 points: the principle of an absolutism requiring that people unquestionably follow the prescriptions of the authorities, and their party activities when the people organized the right popular opinion expressed their attitudes towards political events, up to and including criticism of the autocratic head of state. Count A. Bobrinsky, chairman of the Council of the United Nobility, an influential gentry organization, wrote to the former Minister of Justice, Sheglovitov. My objections are based on the consideration that the Congress of Monarchists represents, shall I say, a street, a Pravaya street, but it's still still a crowd. With the makeup of the Congress, we must be extremely careful about everything concerning the supreme authority. It appears to me that our current resolutions grate against this iron caution. The Monarchist Congress, as any political assembly, would do to adopt resolutions on different political questions, including ministerial appointments. All these are subjects, continued Bobrinsky, about which it is entirely appropriate for members of the State Council to deliberate and even to make statements. These statements would never be known to the public, but the street, even the rightist one, should not give instructions to the sovereign or even criticize his actions. Papadonitsiev and other self-respecting conservatives would have fully agreed to Bobrinsky's opinions. Especially as the street organized somehow into the Union of Russian People, it was not fully convinced, despite their leaders' best efforts, that the Tsar was always above suspicion, as documents shedding light on the internal situation of the SRN demonstrate. Rank and file unionists ventured to voice their annoyance with the Tsar. First of all, they were dissatisfied with the marginal role given to monarchist parties in the monarchical state, especially after the revolution of 1905 had been put down. One provincial member of the SRN complained to Dubrovin that if we were to serve the Tsar, then where is he? This is our Tsar. Why is he doing nothing when his best servants are being abused, for example, you, and we are kicked around again and again like dogs? They wanted themselves to take domineering posts in the state, but membership of the SRN helped only a very few gain promotion. After 1907, the Union was in a state of disarray, but the Tsar did nothing to strengthen the SRN's role. The rank and file of the Dubrovin wing of the SRN in particular criticized Nicholas II for his support of the Stolypin reforms. And again, the Stolypin reforms, to very briefly summarize, were based on the idea of reforming Russia into an empire of loyalist peasant smallholders. But you can say the final culmination of the Emancipation Proclamation, or in the case of the Tsar, not a case in America, obviously. But the issue here, of course, is that this contradicted the role of the gentry, as indeed the Emancipation had. But yes, Rupert.
I was just going to say that one other thing that's slightly incendiary about the Stolypin reforms is that they are explicitly based off the Prussian agricultural model. So, yeah, that doesn't help for Russian nationalists, especially if they're quite anti-German.
And they are becoming increasingly anti-German throughout the course of the next 10 years. I mean, really, Bjorko could have represented a major sort of shift in course, but really from 1905 to 1914, especially after 1908, any association with German or sort of Prussian identity was, Russia was becoming more sort of openly chauvinistic from 1908 onwards, especially towards Austria as well, after a very, very brief detente. In 1909, yeah.
Oh, sorry. One other thing quickly is, to my understanding, the accusation that the Tsar and the government weren't aiding their loyalists is not entirely true. It's just that it wasn't quite so public. So there were a couple of instances that I've read about of at least a couple of instances, of things like Black Hundredists being in cooperation on things like the distribution of various media and newspapers, and even printing newspapers using police funds and police premises and police presses.
I think the irony, though, of course, when looking about police facilitation of Black Hundredist literature, is that the police were also facilitating social revolutionary literature at the same time, and infiltrating the ranks of trade unions as well. So yeah. So again, we're talking about, again, it's sort of very close to the policy which not only the Russian government, but indeed Western governments adopt, in which every organization from the right and the left is in some way infiltrated. So there is essentially no pure grassroots movement. Everything is in some way representative of this political simulacrum.
Yes, I've discussed that at length, talking about the Okhrana in past. But one thing quickly, just while we're on the unions, there was something else I wanted to mention. So seeing as you mentioned the unions, the police unions, or the police affiliated unions set up by Zubatov, sort of ran into the successor to Zubatov, ran into the same kind of issue, where he was trying to sell this rather populist, sort of pragmatic measure in order to diffuse revolutionary tensions and revolutionary energy. He ran into Pobedonostsev, and Pobedonostsev basically said no, it wasn't feasible because it wasn't in keeping with that vision for autocracy, and that's even before 1905.
In 1909, the Black Hundreds reported the Tsar is losing his supporters day by day. The most loyal monarchists, in the total weakness of authority, are already beginning to accuse not only the First Minister. Even a year ago, it was impossible to think that such an appraisal of the actions of the head of the monarchy. It sounded like a threat from those who by 1909 began to understand ministers in Russia could not administer without the Tsar's approval. Patriots came to the conclusion that the government is inclined to play on the side of constitutionalism, or perhaps such is the will of the reigning monarch. The Rasputin affair further alienated the supporters of the autocracy from the ruling autocrat. Society, and especially monarchist circles, were shocked that a scoundrel who took part in public debauchery, had a long history of liaisons with women, and who, according to popular gossip, belonged to the sect of the Kilitsi, a sect known as a group promoting promiscuity, and had direct access and influence over the holiest of holies, the Tsar. Rasputin had been helped to make a fantastic path from his native village in the Tobolsky region to Tsarskoye Selo by the extreme right, which was logical considering their pretenses to the role of the mediating link between the Tsar and the Black Millions. Father John Vostrikov, the leader of the Moscow Rightists, met Rasputin when he still lived in Siberia and saw the strange starlets, a voice from the earth, from the old wooden plough, from the depths of the people. However, Rasputin did not become an agent of the extreme right-wing influence after his establishment at court. He did not appear to have any stable political views, if he had any at all. The Petersburgskaya Gazeta once quoted Grigory, who had formulated his political credo in the following way: "Any politics is harmful. Do you understand? All those Purushkeviches, Dubrovins make the devil happy. They serve him. One should serve people. That is politics." Anti-Semitism was not characteristic of Rasputin, as it was of the Black Hundreds. In general, he felt the right wing of fools, although he helped Alexandra Fedorovna compose answers to telegrams of monarchical groups. As she perhaps thought he could show her the proper tone for interaction with common true-hearted subjects. Ironically, it was the right that began the campaign against Rasputin. The first anti-Rasputin articles were published by Tikhomirov in 1910 in the leading conservative newspaper, the Moscovy Vedomotsy. At the end of 1911, the extreme right in the church attempted to end Rasputin's influence. His former friends, the Black Hundred demagogue monk Iliador and the extreme right-wing bishop of Saratov, Gemogin, invited Rasputin to Gemogin's residence in St. Petersburg, where the two conducted Rasputin's exposure, much to the latter's surprise. Having recounted Rasputin's sins, Bishop Gemogin demanded Rasputin vow to never return to the Tsar's palace. In his memoirs, Father Georgy Shevelsky, a reliable historical source, even wrote that Iliador and like-minded comrades attacked the resistant Siberian peasant and tried to castrate him so as to end once and for all his debauchery, but Rasputin fought back and escaped. He then complained to the emperor that the extreme monarchists, as a result, suffered a terrible humiliation. Gemogin was ordered to leave the capital immediately, lost his post, and was sent to a monastery, while Iliador was exiled to the distant hermitage of Vladimirsky diocese. This clearly demonstrated Rasputin's influence over the church administration. Those suffering from this loudly protested through the media, exposing the very harmful religious heretic and the speaker of the new Kleist teaching in Russia. And again, it should be noted in terms of this idea of Rasputin's influence over the church administration. This is influence over the church administration by proxy, of course, because the Tsar is at the head of the church administration. After that, the already widely known name of Rasputin became used as a symbol, discrediting the monarchy among a wide strata of the population, seriously injuring the prestige of the Tsar and the Empress and the Orthodox hierarchy, which now appeared unable to stand up against the influence of these dark forces. Purushkevich was shocked. He shared his feelings with the Duma chairman Brodzianko, speaking with horror and depression. And the most terrible is, it seems, it comes from the very highest highness of the Tsarist throne. One rogue, klitzed, dirty, illiterate mujik plays with our holy hierarchs. If revolution comes, the Metropolitan Vonitsky, the father of the rightist movement in the southwestern regions, warned it will be a punishment for the preference of the Klistovshchina to Orthodoxy. However, it turned out that the rightists were unable to adopt a unanimous view on Rasputin, as previously on many other questions. The main problem was a necessity to oppose the supreme will of the Tsar. Unlike Tikhomirov or Purekevich, some of the rightists could not find the courage to do so. Dibolovin, as we know, was on good terms with Rasputin. There were those who joined with the admirers of the Starets, such as the editor of the right-wing Kolokol, Skorotsov, as did Nikolsky, who so much wanted finally to satisfy his ambitions to take a powerful position, tried to use Rasputin's influence for the advancement of his own career. By that time, Nikolsky had conflicts with almost all of his former comrades, and in 1912 he took the modest post as Secretary of General Bogdanovich. The general, who was 82, shortly before his death in 1914, sent a letter to Nicholas II, urgently asking him to keep Rasputin away from the throne. Thus, disagreements were seen even among those close collaborators. Yet the majority of the right shared Purushkevich's feelings. For revolutionaries, this situation made Rasputin an incredible find. How it was not true that, as some writers believed, Rasputin was sent by internationalists. In fact, the Black Hundreds contributed more and more to the appearance of this figure that became fatal for Nicholas II. In the last years of the empire, Rasputin's role had grown thanks to a Rasputin clique of incompetents appointed to high government and church positions. This only highlighted the corruption of the regime and strengthened popular hatred. The right wing again played an important role in exposing Rasputin's scandals. The right in the Duma, particularly Purushkevich, whose voice was heard nationwide, exposed the dark forces settled near the throne. One could only be amazed that all of this came from the mouths of people appearing on the political scene to confirm their loyalty to the Tsar. In these circles, a plan arose to get rid of Rasputin. And while the more moderate Shulgin was not in favor of murder, Purushkevich, with aristocratic plotters, killed the most influential peasant of the empire on December the 17th, 1916. Right politics led towards a dead end. The principle of loyalty to the autocracy became incompatible with independent politics, and the principle of fidelity to a nation suffering a world war because of the incompetence and irresponsibility of Rasputin's protégés, appointed by the will of the Tsar. The history of Rasputin illuminates the traditional patriarchal outlook of Nicholas II regarding the Russian political world. Caught up in family concerns, he ignored the appeals, including those of right-wing allies, a source of political support. It remained his belief that a Russian Tsar was not obliged to heed the voice of parties. By 1917, the whole of political society had become extremely irritated with the Tsar. The majority of the right was also largely dissatisfied. A significant group of moderate rights in the Duma, called Progressive Nationalists, where Shulgin played a major role, had entered the Progressive Bloc in 1905 and thus joined the opposition. And of course, this is setting up eventually for the fall of the Tsar in 1917. But I'm going to leave this article from here. And Marcus, if it's all right with you, I'm going to briefly reflect on the course of the war, because of course this is taking it from the perspective of autocracy, the perspective of the Stolypin reforms, and from the perspective of constitution, and from the perspective of constitutionalism and the church, of course. So corresponding to this, there was also the demise of Russia in foreign policy and in the war. Again, I've already mentioned my belief that the Tsar could have rescued himself from this position had he decided to take a stand against his ministers in 1905 and use the Russo-Japanese War as a pretext to take a much harsher stance against Britain. He didn't. And you can say the triumph of British foreign policy in the early 20th century, before they threw it all away in 1914, was the Anglo-Persian Agreement, or is often signaled in hindsight to be the beginning of the Triple Entente alliance in 1907. In terms of what's stemming here, the Tsar, again, I'm not going to get into the origins of World War I because I've gone over them so many times. Again, you can find various sort of iterations of this, but to briefly summarize,
there's replete content on that matter here.
There is replete, and also I've done a whole series of that over on the Lotus Eaters as well, if you want to check that out. But just to very briefly summarize, I do believe Nicholas II. Sazonov in particular wanted war, but Nicholas II blundered into war, which could have been very easily avoided. And when he was at war, he decided to adopt an incredibly aggressive posture in terms of the continuation of Allied war aims. On the most sort of moralistic note, you can say he was not prepared to sign a separate peace in terms of his commitment towards his allies. But in terms of what that really entailed, it meant the complete defeat of Austria, Germany, and now the Ottoman Empire, which will join the war later in 1914. And the implication for that for Russia would mean the dissolution of Austria-Hungary, the potential incorporation of all Slavs within the Austrian Empire into the Kingdom of Serbia, a Russian ally, or taking, say, for example, the Slovaks and the Czechs and placing them under the direct authority of the Tsar, taking Polish land from Germany and creating that as a larger Poland under the headship of the Tsar, and of course dismembering the rest of Germany. However, this would also mean for the Tsar the restitution of Constantinople. I briefly mentioned this in the previous stream, but of course Constantinople does figure in all of these considerations. So you can say that the Tsar's policy, had he been able to see it to fruition, and had he not been deposed in 1917, would have entailed perhaps the most haughty aspirations of all of his predecessors combined. You know, we're talking about the Greek plan, the reform plan of Alexander I, and something which no Tsar had ever previously considered, which was the total dismemberment of Austria, which again was an extension of pan-Slavic policies. And you can see this very clearly. These are some maps which are helpful to indicate, of course, these are the alliance structures. But this map in particular is quite interesting to note because, of course, Russia launches a premature attack to annex East Prussia. It fails, and it leads to a series of defeats. However, as you can see on this map, the Russians were able to advance into the Austrian Empire. They were able to take over Galicia, Lodomeria, with the exception of Polish Galicia up until Krakow. And when
they very nearly break through the Carpathians.
Yes, but basically they establish a frontier of the Carpathians. And you can say if the Russians hadn't been defeated at Tannenberg, had, say, for example, the Germans focused entirely on the Western Front and abandoned East Prussia, as was a possibility, then the Russians would have been able to establish a hard border at the Vistula and at the Carpathians, which would make it almost impossible to dislodge if we're talking about protracted trench warfare. Alas, the Russians attacked prematurely and lost at the catastrophe of Tannenberg. But nevertheless, when you look at the Russian gains against Austria, and the Russians would hold on to those gains for the rest of the duration of the war, it's very much signaling his intent to unite the Ruthenian population, which have not adopted a consciously Ukrainian identity, with that of the rest of the Russian Empire, and that any continued efforts towards Austria, the disintegration of the Austrian Empire, the conquest of Vienna, in concert with the Italians and the Serbs, would have heralded again the glorious aspirations of a pan-Slavic union under the Tsar.
And also to some degree as well. I mean, let's think this notion of pan-Slavism. If we consider also that the Russians have this position whereby, I mean, this doesn't apply to Serbia, obviously, in the strict sense of the word, but is it under Catherine the Great where they gained the title of being guardians of the Orthodox within the Ottoman Empire?
Yes, it's in 1774 after,
Yeah. So there's this idea that the Russians are the guardians of the Orthodox populations of the Ottoman Empire in a sense. Of the Ottoman Empire in a sense, and then also they are, by extension of that policy, sort of guardians of Serbia, who are this sort of pocket of South Slavs who are sort of surrounded by enemies on all sides, or well, maybe not enemies on all sides, but the Slavs have different disagreements with Bulgaria, they have disagreements with the Greeks. Obviously, Austria, the war sort of starts out with friction on that border between the Serbian kingdom and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russians themselves, given their position, they sort of see themselves as the protector of these smaller Orthodox states which reside in the Balkans, and a large part of what we would describe as the tumbling into the Great War is a result of that Russian policy as well, of this mentality that Big Mother Russia of the East has to be the guardian of these smaller, South Slavic brethren that would otherwise be left to their devices. That's an important factor in how this sort of all comes to fruition.
Also, the fairly conscious stoking of Panslavism amongst the South Slavs as well is a big step in how we get here in the first place as well.
Yes.
So under the
those
diplomatic native.
Well, those two things sit in conflict with each other, right, Rupert? If you think about it.
Oh well, yeah, more or less, exactly. But it's potentially laying the groundwork for a kind of union or a junior Slavic state, South Slavic state that would exist in some kind of union with the greater, the Great Russian state, implicitly at least.
Yes, well, again, it's interesting to consider that Tsar Nicholas's policy is ostensibly right-wing, albeit no one on the right really believes him, in the same way that you can look at his foreign policy as something of the most ambitious variety of all of his, compared to all of his predecessors, including Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. Alas, the consistent theme with Nicholas II is that all of these aspirations are doomed to failure, because when looking at his Eastern policy, for example, we could have seen the conquest of Manchuria. We could have seen Russia against some sort of partition in Korea. Alas, that doesn't go well at all. The Tsar blunders into another war and causes Russia to retreat into that position and allow the ascendancy of the Japanese Empire. Such is the case in the West, where not only is Russia denied these gains, but ultimately will suffer a series of defeats which contracts the Russian Empire when it will be subsumed by the Soviet Union. So, Marcus, do you want to, the only sort of things really to sort of notice here, obviously we talk about the Great Retreat following the...
If I may just quickly as well, I do want to emphasize the positive elements of this early Russian, the early Russian war, in that two things that they do achieve is, although it ultimately comes to naught in Tannenberg, their mobilization, which is quite far ahead of the projected schedule by almost everyone, they sort of shock Europe by how quickly they're able to effectively mobilize.
Especially the Germans underestimate them.
Yes, exactly. Not only that, but in the process of this advance into Galatia that's marked out on the map there, they essentially destroy more or less the Austrian professional army, and the officer corps in particular is completely irreplaceable, and they never get that back. They never get back the skill that they and the effectiveness of the army that they lost. So they essentially, in no small part, knock Austria-Hungary rather out of the war there and then, or at least knock it down onto its knees before it's finally.
Yes, just to embellish on that point, the Austrian chief of staff was one Conrad von Herzendorf, and it's not necessarily the military skill which needs to be emphasized regarding the officers within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Is that there was no dominant ethnicity within the empire. The largest ethnicity were the Germans, who only comprised some quarter of the population. The most powerful ethnicity were the Hungarians, who only represented 1/5 of the total population. Despite the Austro-Hungarian connotations, they together were less than 50% of the population. So the officers were actually valued because of their polyglot nature. The fact that if there was a 20% ethnic contingent within a unit, then the officer would have to speak that language. However, of course, it is much easier to train a soldier than it is, say, for example, to compel him to learn 5 languages. So when these polyglots are killed off because of Conrad von Herzendoff's brilliant strategy of dividing the Austrian armies on the eve of the conflict, sending half of them to Serbia, sending half of them to the Eastern Front, it ensures that neither campaign is successful. And only later in 1915 are the Austrians able to finally conquer Serbia. However, again, to follow on from your point, Rupert, is the idea that any gains to be made on the Eastern Front are as a result of German facilitation, if not outright sort of all exclusive German action. The Austrian Empire becomes a dependency on the Eastern Front with Russia, especially after the Brusilov offensive, where the reincorporated Imperial and Royal Army is destroyed again. But as you can see on this map, rather than hold on to the position post the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, the Russian commanders decide on the, you can say, wise policy of exploiting Russia's strategic depth and pouring back to Belarus, Ukraine, and to the borders at Riga, and essentially allowing the Germans to establish Ober-Ost and later the basis of the new Polish state in 1916. For the Russians, this line essentially holds until late in 1917, when you see a variety of political sort of events in Russia, to put it very mildly. But the only sort of major thing of note regarding the actual sort of change in the frontier, of course, Marcus, is the Brusilov offensive. But rather than giving a specific rundown of the Brusilov offensive, Marcus, I just want both of your opinions on this, because at this point, the Tsar has taken over supreme command of the war effort. Do you think that the Brusilov offensive had any impact in terms of securing Nicholas's reign? Because obviously he would be deposed only a few months later.
Well, the Brusilov offensive is important insofar that, from a standpoint of pure sort of military history, what we do see is if I could just make a slightly tangential point, is that we see the origin of what would later be called stormtrooper or Stoßtruppen tactics be devised in the German army, and also in the Russian army, as is exercised by Brusilov in this 1916 offensive. But they develop in isolation from each other in rather distinct circumstances. And what the Brusilov offensive does demonstrate is that the Russian army, when it is, somewhat well equipped, when it is well led, and when it is commanded by a general who is not just competent, but I'd say is an excellent general, it can perform in the field. The problem is, not every general is a Brusilov, and Brusilov can't be everywhere at once. And the second part is that, although by this point at this point in the war, and I have said this on other streams too, that where the World War I German army was so in some ways even outperformed its equivalent in World War II, is that when you look at the Alpine front with Austria, there are German divisions supporting the Austrian efforts there. There are German divisions interdispersed with Austrian divisions along the Carpathians. There's I believe German units actually assisted the Austrians with eventually overwhelming Serbia. There were German advisors and German artillery in amongst the Ottoman forces in the Dardanelles, in the Palestine campaign, and also in Mesopotamia. So, the Germans are sort of everywhere helping their allies at any given point in time. And so, Brusilov obviously targets, or the Russians target the weaker element of this front, and that is against Austria-Hungary. But the Austrians absolutely require German help to sort of stem the tide, because these tactics are are effective rather. But the point is that, does this have an impact on Tsar Nicholas's reign? Ultimately, no. I just don't think that, given the Russian industrial base at this point in time, is sufficient to sort of make up the damage of a Russian army that has been sort of mauled at the very onset of the war. You got to think General Samsonov shoots himself because he basically has, he's thrown away essentially an entire army corps against, an inferior force that was led by Hindenburg and Ludendorff in the Battle of Tannenberg in the Masurian Lakes. And this defensive line is a sensible option along what we can see on this, particularly on the left-hand map. It's obvious. Is the Dvina River, which runs from Riga down sort of through the Pripyat marshes, is perfect defensive territory. But I think when we deliberate and sort of reflect on some of the things that you've been reading from the source material and from stuff that people like us know, broadly speaking, of Russia from this time, is that there's a lot of internal problems within Russia, and also there is something to be said for when leaders take command and try to micromanage more when things go wrong. And what's actually interesting is that, because obviously we've just done a couple streams about, Stalin and the grand strategy of Stalin. And, Stalin could be, well, is very easily argued to be more of an autocrat than both his German equivalent and the Tsar, in this case, Nicholas. And after learning harsh lessons in the first year and the first 2 years of the war, he actually entrusts more and more to his generals to actually exercise operational and strategic, or rather tactical freedom. Whereas, say, in the case of Tsar Nicholas, there's more and more interference from the top echelons of government, and of course the Fuhrer makes the same mistake in Germany. And so, the point I'm making is that I don't know whether there's any sort of other way in which Russia prevails in World War One based upon the inherent problems that already exist within the country, and many of those problems which stem from the Tsar himself.
Well, yes, just to build on your point, Stalin was undisputedly head of the Soviet home front, whereas when you look at the Tsar, he is very much considered, absent from the home front. And
yes, indeed.
This is terrible in terms of taking what we've already talked about, Rasputin, and how someone has mentioned in the chat. Yes, he was in favor of peace, but what are the political implications of Rasputin being in favor of peace while the Tsar is commanding the war effort to the front and he's influencing the core faction at home? That he's implicated for being a German spy. Indeed, in concert with the Tsar's German wife, it is not a good PR move in terms of helping the Tsar in his war effort, to say the least. Indeed, Alexandra takes over a preeminent position, and again, this idea of the court of incompetence surrounding, like Boris Duma, the final interior minister, one Protopopov, and again, the situation in the Duma, which has continually dissolved despite voting through vast war payments to the Tsar, kind of like the German Reichstag. Interestingly, when you look at figures like Bettmann Hollweg, the German chancellery, and even the army were able to maintain a much better relationship with the ostensibly hostile legislature dominated by Social Democrats. But the Tsar was incompetent in his handling with the Duma, which all it did was create friction and hostility towards, again, the real government in Russia, which was handled by Alexandra and Rasputin. But linking this back to what you mentioned about the home front, there were specific issues. There was hyperinflation. There was food hoarding. There was, because of mobilization, many farmers had to rely on subsistence. And essentially this meant that not enough food was coming to the cities. Part of the process of the alliance with France had meant that Russia had received a huge amount of international capital. However, the capital was very much directed at bringing up something you brought up earlier, Rupert, the facilitation of a rapid mobilization against Germany. This was not intended to sustain a large war effort, which would require, say, for example, building industrial cities, as you've mentioned, Marcus, in terms of the limits of Russian industrialization, which will only continue later under the Soviets. As a result of that, you have many overcrowded cities, which are now being flooded as a result of the war, which don't have the infrastructure to sustain them. And you don't have railways providing grain to the cities. So people are starving in the cities, and out in the country, they're having to rely on subsistence. And of course, you also have the Ottomans blockading maritime access through the Black Sea, and you have the Germans blockading maritime access through the Baltic Sea. So everything has created these conditions where there is this general discontent on the home front. There is distrust of the government. The Tsar is considered absent, and the Tsar isn't doing enough in terms of being able to take the war situation, which would have helped significantly, and being able to show any decisive results. The most decisive result of the Brusilov offensive is that Romania joins the war, launches a brief sortie into Transylvania, is defeated, and as you can see on this map, the large part of Romania is ultimately occupied by the end of 1916.
Which I might. Oh, so sorry, Rupert. Just very briefly, just because I am mentioned Romania, the collapse of Romania and the fact that it happened in such a quick succession is actually indicative of one of the most impressive operations of World War One that is actually often overlooked. Romania is knocked out in a matter of months. You might say the better part of a year, or in a matter of months, but the remaining entry into the war almost has no effect on the eventual outcome of it. The Central Powers deal with Romania in a very, very rapid, fashion. Just want to say that it's actually an impressive feat militarily, given this age of, heavy artillery, machine guns, static warfare, trenches, etc. Sorry, go on, Rupert.
I just wanted to raise sort of the opposite point, actually, because I think one of the major, especially political implications of the Brusilov offensive is that it seems to have instilled quite a lot of confidence in the military that if the Tsar and his government would simply get out of the way, then the generals and the military could quite easily just win the war. But I think that's quite decisively proved to be incorrect. Not only does the home front suffer after the war, even more than it ever had under the Tsar, but the military kind of falls into shambles almost immediately when it's called to go into action after the abdication of the Tsar.
No, I think that's actually a very good point that needs to be considered, because I do believe you. I do believe there is an overconfidence in the army that, again, it requires a firm hand, basically a military dictator, to take the war situation and essentially build upon the gains of the Brusilov offensive. And of course,
it's especially bad because you mentioned the food shortages briefly, but I believe if you actually go into the sort of macro data, the amount of food being produced is actually sufficient. The problem is that there's not enough rolling stock.
Yes, there's a problem is logistics rather than the actual process of creating food.
And as I understand it, the reason why there wasn't enough rolling stock is because the military was mishandling it. It was all getting plugged up at the front.
Well, not only mishandling, but we're talking about endemic corruption as well. Sometimes you would actually need to bribe an official in order for him to permit the passage of certain goods to certain places as well. So we're talking about an entire government apparatus which is in shambles, corrupt. You have a corrupt clique, which has no sort of consistent policy around the Tsar. And you also have a military who believe that the Tsar can essentially be removed and they can run the war better than he can. You have general dissatisfaction from the family, from the Romanov family with Alexandra. I mean, Prince Yusupov, of course, is one of the main instigators in the assassination of Rasputin. So from all segments, I mean, of course, the strike, which leads indirectly to the abdication of the Tsar, of course, happens on International Women's Day as part of general socialist agitation. However, all it does is simply set in motion, crystallizing all of the opposition from all of these forces, from the army, which is the crucial difference in terms of the nature of the abdication, from the right and indeed from the left. And of course, it is the army who ultimately serve Nicholas the ultimatum. I just want to come back to this. Yeah,
it's very interestingly one general in particular, essentially, that serves him the ultimatum, which is General Rusky. And there's an interesting anecdote about that, in that, data point about that, in that right as the disturbances in Petrograd were being reported, Nicholas actually gives the order to send back reliable cavalry units, and I think I have a feeling I know which ones, but that's an irrelevant detail and speculation on my part. But that order is never passed down, and so I think it's 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, everything is completely out of control by that point. The order has never been passed down from Rusky to actually send on the cavalry, and he sort of lets things get out of control. And then by some accounts, he is the one that is literally pressing Nicholas's hand to the abdication letter in order to make him step down. So I am very firmly convinced that Rusky himself is personally a traitor in this whole escapade.
Well, I mean, to be fair also to Rusky, it wasn't just him. It was an entire clique. First of all, you had political pressure coming from the Duma, such as Rodzianko. And then, of course, I think when looking at the logistics of it's not just Rusky, you have, of course, Guchov, who you've mentioned as well. And then you also
Guchov was also present in the room, as it happened.
And then, of course, you also have Alekseev, who has essentially gone around to ascertain the feelings of the individual commanders, all of which are essentially for abdication. So even though Rusky is the one to compel him to do so, his position politically, his position militarily he's lost all credibility at this point on all fronts, essentially. So it is not surprising. What is surprising is what happens next in terms of the complete dissipation of the right. And I just want to quickly bring us back to this article just to read one page, and then I want to discuss more aspects in depth. It is not surprising that in February of 1917, the Tsar's abdication led to the unanimous rejoicing. Who would stand with him? Asked Shogun, shaken by the events. He has no one, no one. The downfall of the monarchy led immediately to the breakup of right-wing parties. The history of this strange phenomenon, small fragmentary monarchist parties in the country where in theory everyone was supposed to be absolutely loyal to their autocrat, was now over. Regardless of all undercurrents, especially by 1917, noticeable internal opposition to Nicholas II, ideologically right-wing groups were so tightly linked to the monarchy that the fall of the latter led to their immediate liquidation. With an iron grip, monarchism hampered the development of a conception, natural for nationalist movements, of a popular national leader instead of a venerated traditional Tsar. And just to add to that, when Nicholas II abdicates, the general expectation is that he is going to pass that authority on to his son, Tsarevich Alexis. And this would essentially satisfy all parties. It would satisfy the quote-unquote moderate right, the constitutional rightists, led by Rodzianko, who would essentially believe that he could be raised as a constitutional Tsar. Yet it would also satisfy the right as well, and the army, who essentially believe that he could be a rallying figure through which they can essentially augment the will of the autocracy through the young Tsar. However, to everyone's shock, when the Tsar abdicates, he also abdicates for Tsarevich Alexis. And this is because the truth of his condition, his haemophilia, has not been made known, apart from figures very close to the Tsar in the imperial family. The only way to really hold on to the monarchy after that point was to rely on Tsar Michael. But of course, as members of the Russian right have already made very clear, they have an exceptionally low opinion of Michael in the sense that they believe he's an idiot and he's irresolute. And
not only that, but I believe he was actually in on the Guchikov coup, and that's why Guchikov actually suggests him explicitly during the discussion about or the pressuring into the abdication.
And pressuring into the abdication of Tsarevich Alexis as well. But the problem is that he's a coward. He doesn't take the authority when it's handed to him, and instead he decides he's going to wait for a popular mandate. First of all, this completely undercuts any notion of the Tsar as the venerated and hereditary head of the nation. The idea that the Tsar is now dependent on a popular mandate, kind of like the Orleanists in France, or the idea of being Tsar of the Russians rather than Tsar and autocrat of the Russias. And so, as a result of this, he creates a political vacuum, and he creates a damning precedent for the monarchy, which in all senses from this point on, he has become a total irrelevance. So the Bolsheviks can carry on. They can liberally remove him a couple of days after they assassinate the imperial family in Ekaterinburg. So this is a really important point to emphasize, is that the Romanov family have effectively signed their own death warrant by this, when it wasn't apparent to anyone in March or February by the old calendar of 1917 that the Tsar's abdication would imply the abolition of the Russian Tsardom.
Yeah, I mean, in that vein, I am very firmly of the belief that right up until the point of the abdication, the entire situation is still completely in hand, especially if those cavalry units those cavalry corps had actually been sent. But never mind. One other thing I did want to say though quickly is that you mentioned the essential liquidation of the right, and especially the extreme right, so the Black Hundredists and such. That's a little bit more literal than is implied there, because not least due to their cooperation with the police, quite a lot of the figures were quite well known, and so a lot of them are deliberately targeted by the provisional government immediately, in the same breath as they're disbanding the Okhrana and releasing all the various political prisoners, and sort of issuing a general amnesty on anyone. So there's a complete flip of the police state apparatus essentially.
Still, these tendencies in pre-revolutionary Russian nationalism had their place. The VNS celebrated Stolypin as a leader of Russian nationalism in many ways, and Shulgin expressed the opinion that in certain circumstances, Stolypin would be ideal to sit on the Tsarist throne. Among the Black Hundreds, who ideologically were closer to fascism by identification of friends and enemies through national identity and populist demagoguery, scholars noticed the appearance of a leader of a cult of a certain Führerprinzip type. Yet the particularly auxiliary role right-wing parties played in the autocratic regime of Nicholas II did not allow anyone to arise from their numbers who could pretend to the position of national leader. One of the main reasons that Russia did not anticipate in Italian history, where the Duce pushed the monarch down to a secondary position, was the enormous, and again, I push back against that in the sense that Italy was already a liberal democracy at that point, and Orlando and other figures were already well in the position of power over Vittorio Emanuele. But anyway, was the enormous authority of the Russian Tsar looking down from the heights of the throne upon the small bustle of right-wing leaders trying to obtain his good graces. After the civil war and exile, where the Black Hundreds were liberated from the grip of the Tsarist order, it grew quite naturally into fascism. However, in Russia until 1917, such a development was blocked by the reign of Nicholas II, who did not give nationalists the chance to lay claim to that authority the Tsar himself jealously guarded. The revolt against the Tsarist authorities for the sake of the power of the Tsar was impossible. Markov wrote as an emigre, "We had to turn down aggressive state-building activity or fascism, and deeply retreat to keep the banners of the holy autocracy." The rule was confirmed whereby an authoritarian regime's restraints, the possible appearance of nationalist or populist dictatorship that receives its chance in a crisis of liberal democracy. The striking weakness of monarchist doctrine was an issue which would become critical under Nicholas II, what a good monarchist should do if Providence gave a wrong card, and authority was passed to a Tsar who was harmful to the fatherland. An unlimited autocrat in the Black Hundreds preferred type, unrestricted even by those laws granted to him by his predecessors, looked frightening for the country if he set an incorrect political course. Alas, apart from hoping for good fortune, monarchists could not resolve this dilemma. His book, published in emigration after the end of the Civil War, Shulgin planned out in his imagination that the throne after a restoration will be occupied by a Tsar with the traits of a Peter Stolypin. However, there was no guarantee that things would turn out this way. Instead of the alter ego of Stolypin, another fatal figure would not appear on the throne and lead the country into a new catastrophe. Shulgin, one of the more broad-thinking authors among the right, could not deliver any such guarantee. So we've talked about the implications of not just the removal of Tsar Nicholas II, but the whole gutting of the right, which stems from the haphazard nature of the fall of the monarchy. Indeed, as Rupert has brought up, the idea that once the Duma finds itself in power and finds itself in a position essentially of inaugurating a Russian republic, much to everyone's shock, and no one really expected this, we go from a liberal Duma under the Prince Lvov, and rapidly we have a radical Duma under Alexander Kerensky and the social revolutionaries. Yet, as a consequence, you can say, of the loss of the Tsar, and again, the idea which is wedded to the idea of Tsarism as a political ideology, and not just as a political fact, is the idea that the Tsar and the nation are one, inseparable, indissoluble. And so it therefore only seems appropriate that when you have the loss of the Tsar, what does it inaugurate? It inaugurates political chaos. There is an absence of legitimacy. There is an absence of political authority. But what I find most interesting in the context of all this is why the right in particular, those who had been nominally in the ascendant, albeit when we look at the popular right, that was not the case, how they can be so easily outmaneuvered so decisively. And when we look to the situation in Petrograd, when we look at the Soviets and we look at the provisional government, it is not the contest between the rights and the left. Instead, it is a contest between two left-wing visions. And the distinguishing factor is less the idea that they represent any fundamental difference in policy, other than, of course, the avowed Bolsheviks, but rather that they hold opposite opinions towards the war. So in the case of Kerensky, you can say, is the continuation of the war policy of the generals, believing that all it would take would be one decisive push and the whole German-Austrian war front would collapse. But as you can see with this map on the Kerensky offensive, that was a total disaster. And of course, more damning for the army, Kerensky believed that this situation could be ameliorated with reforms in the army, which albeit they only seem to produce more and more insubordination at a time where individual units have been infiltrated by the Bolsheviks, who, again, as part of the Soviets, were almost all agitating for peace. Yes, Rupert.
The map doesn't actually quite do justice to how much of a catastrophe the Kerensky offensive was, because not only do those lines on the map change, but the entire army virtually disintegrates after the first was it week or so.
I mean, this is supposed to be a fight for, democratic Russia in concert with, things like the Third Battle of Ypres. And this is supported by American money, by French money, by British money. This is, the Americans have now entered the war. And this whole facade, you can say, of a democratic Russia committed to the war and the disillusion of these quote unquote sort of reactionary militant powers of Germany and Austria, this whole illusion comes crashing down very quickly. And now one's faced with the reality that sustaining the provisional government in power, and by extension their international backers, will essentially mean the continuation of the war potentially for years to come. And so it therefore seems only logical in this situation that the Bolsheviks will come into power. But I want to ask this question in terms of where the right is on the scene all the way up until 1918, because to my mind, the right, so far it exists at all, only comes from factions within the army. And so do either of you have a perspective on the Kornilov affair?
I have a perspective in that I still think it's very up in the air as to what was actually even happening there. I've read so many conflicting accounts as to whether or not, what Kornilov's opinions even were, because he was rather reticent about them for much of the time, and what was even the purpose of him attempting to move on Petrograd, because the question of whether or not he was actually pursuing any kind of so I mean, in the most innocent version of the story, essentially he is simply going to try and find out face to face what is actually going on with the chain of command, because he's being consistently given orders which are in direct conflict with one another, and he's completely unable to maintain the war under such conditions. Obviously, there's the other version, which is a little bit more popular, that he was trying to institute a kind of military dictatorship, and that is sort of in keeping with the mainline military thought at the time. And I think he gives a speech at some point, sort of like shortly preceding that, which to an audience of mostly, I think it was junior officers, which is much in the line, in line with that idea, and that's where where quite a lot of the bolstering of that idea comes from. But it's still not entirely clear that that's ultimately what he wanted, not least because he seems to be in lockstep at on almost every point prior to that with the likes of Kerensky.
Just for clarification for people who don't know, obviously, when we're talking about the chronology of events of 1917, by now the social revolutionaries and Kerensky are in power, albeit Russia has yet to hold national elections, which are already scheduled to take place at the end of this year. The government is still provisional. Lenin, as a result of German orchestration, is now back in Russia and agitating. And during the July days, there was a possibility that the Soviets could have taken power much earlier than they did historically. Alas, the July days are bungled, and Lenin briefly enters into exile again in Finland. Shortly after that, when it appears that there is no, as Rupert has said, no clear chain of command, and the army is in a state of disarray, and there is still an army faction committed to the continuation of the war. So we're talking about, is it a degree of maintaining discipline within the army to remain committed to the continuation of the war effort? Or does this ostensible coup a month after the July days actually represent an attempt to establish a military dictatorship? And if it were an attempt to establish a military dictatorship, what would it be a military dictatorship in service of? Would Kornilov hand off to another figure, or would he hand off to a Romanov? Again, we don't know. And I don't see it as signaling any sort of significant return to the right, which is, again, when looking at the 1917 series of revolutionary sort of escalations, it is remarkable to consider how passive and inept the right are throughout this entire process. And really, it's only in the aftermath of the October Revolution and the accelerated radicalism of the Soviets that we begin to see any backlash at all. And even then, the backlash of the quote unquote right has so many qualifiers. So again, just to briefly give an overview of what happens, of course, The Bolsheviks, who have been agitating for revolution, are now based in Petrograd. They have expanded party membership. As Rupert has said, there has been the release of various political prisoners. Trotsky is back in Petrograd, agitating from the Petrograd Soviet as a Bolshevik, having been a Menshevik. And Lenin comes and organizes the coup alongside Trotsky. On the 24th of October, we have the coup. The government is sent into exile. And of course, this is with the support of mutinous soldiers, most notably the Kronstadt sailors. Very soon after, we see the creation of a Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, the creation of the Council of People's Commissars with Lenin as chairman. We also have the Constituent Assembly elections, which were planned. The government, which is now under the control of the Bolsheviks, simply believes that this is going to be a vindication, a verification of the fact that they have now attained power. However, this delivers a quite decisive victory for Kerensky's party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party. And this is in many ways indicative of the fact that the constituency of the Bolsheviks were the urban working classes and the disaffected in the army. And so it's only therefore appropriate that the large peasant masses, who would later become the Greens in the Russian Civil War, or some said the Whites, would join hands with the Social Revolutionaries rather than the Bolsheviks. But yes, Rupert.
There's another quite significant constituency which was forming a major part of the Bolsheviks, especially early on, and that's criminals. They emptied out the prisons, and quite a lot of them found themselves in the Bolsheviks. Yes, I remember there were the memoirs which my fiance read of a police chief in Moscow, I believe it was, who remarks. So he sort of goes back and forth about a lot of different figures that and cases that he dealt with over his career and over his life, and he mentions at the end of quite a lot of them that when having dealt with a criminal at some point, and perhaps put him in jail or something, he runs into him in the street a few days later, not a few days later, but a few years later after the revolution, wearing some kind of Bolshevik uniform.
And that's certainly wonderfully appropriate, but of course this is entirely consistent with Bolshevik thinking that any person or any act is acceptable so long as it services the end of the revolution. And in terms of just, again, appreciating the attacks on the right, something which we don't have time to discuss really, unfortunately, is that the fall of the Tsar also heralds a major shift in the administration of the Orthodox Church, because, of course, since Tsar Peter the Great, the entire administration of the Orthodox Church had been predicated on the headship of the Tsar. Now the Tsar is gone, and so the Orthodox Church do something which is rather incredible, and they elect a patriarch for the first time in 200 years. However, you now have a patriarch at the head of a church which is seen to some extent as hostile by the militantly atheistic new Bolshevik regime. So it's corresponding at this time that we find you can see have the unshackling of the Orthodox Church away from that state authority. But of course, when you have ecclesiastical authority, it in many ways needs the acquiescence or supervision by temporal authority. Otherwise, it becomes essentially rudderless in the most sort of benign of cases, unable to exert any serious political will. But of course, in the case of the Soviets, it represents a contention for that legitimation of rule, given the fact that orthodoxy still holds such a sway. And so estates, noble estates, but also the lands of the church were nationalized by the Bolshevik government, and they were redistributed to the peasants. But of course, this is part of a process which was already ad hoc taking place throughout 1917. We see a general censorship of religious and not just right-wing, but left-wing media outlets as well. We see the consolidation, essentially, of Communist Party control throughout Russia. We see the entire abolition of the Russian legal system as it existed to that point. But in terms of further attacks on the basis of orthodoxy in Russia, now that the autocracy is gone, we have secular education, which is made universal. Religious education is abolished. Religious orphanages are abolished. Divorce is made significantly easier. Abortion is legalized. And not
Can
only
I
is
just
abortion...
ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Sorry, when you say religious education is abolished, does that mean insofar that it's just ended, or that it's actually then hence therefore prohibited as well?
We see the abolition of religious schools in that sense.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And again, the incorporation into it. It should be also noted that
Sorry, I
during
didn't mean
the
to nitpick, but sometimes
no,
a bit
no,
of a
no,
difference in
it's
scale.
good for clarification. It should also be noted that the Bolshevik education system was very, very liberal in the first sort of decade of socialist rule. However, by the time of Stalin, we see an attempt to impose Tsarist era discipline back in the classroom as well. So there were a lot of radical sort of reforms made in the reform of education. So, abortion is another such case. Women's rights is another such instance in terms of trying to completely overturn Russian society, but it's only in the 1930s. And indeed, this is the same with the nationalities policy with colonization. But it's only in the 1930s that we see a deliberate turn, you can say, back to the right in terms of trying to harmonize the Russian government as it existed with essentially Sovietism, and that's why Stalin was in many ways accused of being a traitor to the revolution. But
And
during
in some
the
ways, hence the Red Tsar moniker as well.
yes, but during the 1920s, we are seeing the Leninists, the Bolsheviks, trying to completely monopolize not just the economy, control over the army, control over the political system, the apparatus, but also over the social system as well. And of course, now we have the issue of what to do with the war. Now there has been a gradual, you can say, elimination of all non-Bolsheviks from the political system. So many leftists have collaborated in the original coup. By 1919, virtually all Mensheviks and social revolutionaries have been expelled, and one-party rule was established. And by April of 1918, the Bolsheviks, having again tried and failed to hold on to some gains vis-a-vis the Germans, only to initiate a final offensive by the Germans in early 1918, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And as we've gone into briefly on our Stalin streams, this, of course, is simply a temporary peace, a temporary truce between Germany and Russia, which ultimately comes to nothing given the collapse of the German Empire and the Russian Civil War, and indeed the independence wars, which coincide with the Russian Civil War. In many ways, a Russian Civil War is a bit of a misnomer when we're talking about the grand imperial scope of it and the implications of the independence movements, most notably in the Baltic, but of course in the Caucasus and indeed in Central Asia. Sorry, Marcus, we wanted to say something.
No. I'm just merely concurring. All I was going to say is that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk really for the Bolsheviks is a treaty of strategic reprieve, but ultimately, as we know, as has transpired in our reality, the Germans try and throw everything westward. They roll the dice they roll the dice and throw everything into the St. Michael offensive, the spring offensive of 1918, which fails, which then leads to Germany's defeat. And essentially these areas which they have, you might say temporarily ceded for the sake of expediency end up becoming a non-factor anyway, because they're able to sort of, in the aftermath of what we call the Russian Civil War, end up being not entirely, but largely reincorporated back into the state, as it were.
So I'd like
what would become the Soviet Union, I suppose. Sorry, Rupert.
Also worth noting quickly, the success in managing to attain the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk ended up causing a bit of trouble for the Germans in the end during Operation Michael, because they'd left all their cavalry to police the newly administered areas, and so they found that once they did successfully,
upwards of like 500,000 or 600,000 men were left to garrison it.
Yeah.
Like I said, a lot of cavalry. Yeah.
Yeah, well, essentially all their cavalry. They had no cavalry to take part in Operation Michael, as I recall. So what that meant is that when they did successfully break open the Allied lines, they had nothing other than the speed of foot to go and try and make an exploitation of that. And well, we saw how well that went. The other thing I did want to say is quickly that this wasn't exactly intended by the Soviets. So the way that we've just been talking about it, it sort of makes it sound as though they sort of agreed to give all this away as a sort of temporary expedient in a sense that it was part of their plan, but it really wasn't. They had the genius idea of neither agreeing to peace nor to war, and the German response to that was to simply sort of metaphorically shrug and then carry on advancing eastwards as far as they could go. And the way that often manifested was essentially they would have a load of troops on a train, drive to a station or settlement, get out, have all the make all the troops that were there surrender, hop back on the train and carry on to the next station. And that the borders that you see there is essentially how far they got before the Russian delegates came to surrender to them personally.
So, Marcus, before I get into our next article, which talks about the propaganda efforts of trying to organize a ideology vis-a-vis the Soviets, of which, of course, are very consolidated under Lenin, can you take us through the creation of the volunteer army and the birth of the opposition to the Bolsheviks, the White Movement?
In fairness, as a subject I'm more familiar with than I'm more aware of than being familiar with. But I mean, what we ultimately do see is sort of a splintering of the armies, because you mentioned just 5 or so minutes ago that with the aftermath of the Kerensky offensive and the tremendous laxing of the rules and the implementation of discipline in the army sort of totally goes out the windows with the reform of the Mensheviks. We have full blown Bolshevik infiltration of the army, and so there are instances where entire sort of portion of the army break off and sort of end up joining the rebellion once, or the revolt once it breaks out. And essentially the army ultimately, as in like the Russian army as the state's forces, kind of split down the middle, as it were, not by exact numbers, of course. And a portion of it becomes the nucleus of Trotsky's Red Army, at which point afterwards, I mean, to my knowledge, because like I said, I don't have in-depth knowledge on this subject. Trotsky implements very harsh conscription laws, like to the point where they actually start, almost from the onset of the support of these social stratas that are supporting the Bolsheviks, they almost turn them against the revolution at the moment of its inception, because these conscription demands are very stringent. Meanwhile, what tends to happen is, given the vastness of Russia and obviously where a number of these generals find themselves, that you actually have quite disparate counter-revolutionary forces, if we can call them that tend to coalesce on the fringes. And the Ukrainian situation is a little bit difficult, because whilst you have activities of Wrangel and Denikin in the south, they sort of are somewhat not interdispersed, not the right way to put it, but you have the Ukrainian revolts that are occurring concurrently with them. And so actually you can see on this map here, Denikin and Wrangel, where they're positioned is very close to that it would be considered today sort of central / western Ukraine, as is the nation state today. And then in the north you have Yudenich, and I believe, and then Yevgeny Miller around Finland and the northern port of Arkhangelsk, and of course Dutov, who you could almost consider is almost a deputy to Kolchak, and Kolchak, who eventually rises to being the supreme leader of Russia.
Although, but just again to very quickly add to that, there is a government called the PARG, which consists of social revolutionaries, cadets. Essentially, you can say the members who were kicked out of the Bolsheviks from the provisional government reconstitute themselves as a new provisional government. But of course, as indicative of the divided nature of the quote-unquote whites, Kolchak is the one who tries to temporarily find some. Again, we're talking about the rights and the right desirous of resolution and will. You can say that Kolchak was the final attempt to try and attain that sort of status among the opponents to the onslaught of the Bolshevik left. But yes, just continue. That's just a quick interjection.
No. That's absolutely fine. Ultimately, like I say, Kolchak rises to the position of being the supreme leader of Russia, and most of the sort of the leadership, because it's sort of hard. We call them the whites or the counter-revolutionary force, but the white Russian forces more or less accede to that sort of reality, shall I say. And it's interesting that even amongst the allies, as in the Western allies, there's sort of disagreements about how to support this amongst themselves. Where, for instance, the British are quite enthusiastic for the for recognizing Kolchak and his government, particularly I believe it's Churchill, but Churchill's kind of torpedoed by David Lloyd George, who is essentially of the state of mind that he doesn't want to recognize Kolchak as being the supreme leader of Russia without agreement of the Americans. However, because of the obvious anti-liberal bent of many of these previously Tsarist generals and Tsarist officers, Woodrow Wilson and his administration, essentially, certainly his upper part of his cabinet, are very much vehemently opposed to any widespread recognition of Kolchak. And certainly, whilst, because I'm sure you gentlemen, because you're more educated on this subject than I am, would be aware that Kolchak, for instance, was not very enthusiastic in terms of regarding the secession of fringe territories such as Finland. For instance, as an instance here, actually you can see on this map here, Yudenich gathers a force of just under 20,000 men in Estonia and actually succeeds on pushing on St. Petersburg. And I can't remember who his deputy is, but he's on very good terms with Karl von Mannerheim, who's who by the end of the war is a very successful cavalry officer in the Russian cavalry, in one of the Russian cavalry units, one of the Imperial cavalry units. And it's said that Yudenich asked his deputy to, via Mannerheim, encourage the Finns to basically partake in a two-pronged attack on St. Petersburg. And because of the Kolchak's position via the independence of Finland, the Finns don't join in on the attack. So Yudenich falls literally a couple of kilometers short of the St. Petersburg-Moscow railway line, which then allows Trotsky and the Red Army Command to basically rush reinforcements to St. Petersburg, defend the city. Yudenich is pushed back. And then at this point, the Estonians, I'm assuming it's in like 1919, 1920, by that point have assumed their guarantees of national independence from the Soviet government, from the essentially what you call the USSR. And so, in fact, Yudenich is forced to retreat out of Estonia because he's seen as more of a hindrance than a help to their independence aspirations. So that's true of Yudenich's situation. Because in the end, there's so much back and forward, and I think we've talked about this in another stream, AM, that if you think about the sheer length of the fronts here, and this is also in the the immediate aftermath of World War One and the Spanish flu. I mean, you're talking about a vast amount of frontage, and particularly the further east you go, even European Russia in the 1920s doesn't have fantastic infrastructure. It's certainly not Germany, and it's not even France or Italy by many stretches of the imagination. Certainly outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow and some of the larger cities such as Kharkov or Minsk or Smolensk, there's not a lot of infrastructure even in European Russia. And then you go into the Pontic, the Siberian plains, there's almost nothing. And you can see here, sort of on this map, take for instance, can
I explain this map?
Of course.
I've been looking for a good Civil War map for a while now, and this is obviously a Soviet era map. Of course, it's in Russian, but I want to obviously regarding your point around frontage, this sort of adds to that, and I also want to sort of bring in something thematic here, which is the fall of the Third Rome, because if you look at the orange, which comprises the territory held by the Bolsheviks around 1919, when the whites were at their quote-unquote height, what does that territory show? That territory essentially shows the original territory of the Tsardom of Muscovy before we see it expanding into Siberia. In other words, this was the original territory at the point where Moscow essentially decided to self-designate itself as the inheritor of the mantle of Constantinople, even moving the capital back to Constantinople. In other words, this represents core Orthodox Russia. Yet at the same sense, it is under the control of essentially an anti-Russian, a large part Jewish cadre, who are against the whole notion at this point of Russian nationalism. They believe in superseding nationalism, creating an internationalist socialist state, which would mobilize the forces of the global proletariat. And yet it is in this awkward position where you see the rights, the white rather, the right represents the empire. It does not represent Russia proper, as you can see here, the original territory of the Muscovite Tsardom. Instead, it has to contend with all of these nationalities. So the nationality aspect of this, when we talked about, what really does Tsarism and nationality really entail? Well, at the heart, if you're looking at this as an extension of Muscovy, then it has to represent everything which Muscovy does not. It has to reconcile itself with all of these nationalist revolutions. And we're seeing, the advent really of Ukrainian nationalism as a political force. Before then, it had only been a sort of ideological conception. In the same way that we're looking at nationalism in the Caucasus, we're looking at nationalism in the Baltic states, which already had a established tradition of autonomy within the Russian Empire, and of course Finland as well. And then you look at Siberia, which again you can say is a consequence of. Sorry, Rupert, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just there's a few things that I would probably want to add on, but one thing I did want to pick up on quickly, just to avoid any confusion, is terming the whites in this situation, especially people like Kolchak or the founders of the volunteer army, Alekseev and Kornilov, as well as probably Denikin and maybe to a lesser extent Wrangel, calling these people the right in the same way that we've been talking about the Russian right earlier in the video doesn't make sense. It's these people that we're talking about, the leaders of the white movement at this point, are all people who would very firmly be on the left of the previous conversation, because they all believe in some version of either republicanism of some sort, maybe, but they were all in favor of the abdication of the Tsar, for one thing, and they're all somewhat liberal.
Yes, but as we've seen with the abdication of the Tsar, that was supported by all factors, including on the right. When I use the word right, again, as an extension of this conversation, because we're talking about the end of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, and that by extension talks about the end of the right. As with all right-wing movements, it should be noted, when faced with a determined leftist opposition, and in the absence of an ideologue like Podolotov, what happens to the right? The right simply cucks, for lack of a better word. It simply becomes more progressively moderate, liberal, until it essentially adopts the platforms of those who they were previously opposing.
I think it is an important distinction there, because the right that we've been discussing earlier does actually play a very small part in places, and it does sort of attempt to re-emerge, but never quite gets the same momentum behind it that the white movement writ large does, and that would be in the form of things like the southwestern government under Fedor Keller. So he attempts to bring in a lot of these people who directly were affiliated with the Black Hundreds and various former Tsarist officials, but he doesn't quite get enough traction to actually turn that into a larger movement.
Yes, but if we look at the Cossacks, for example, the Cossacks are renowned for their vertical relationship to the Tsar, and yet when we look at the restoration of some sort of resurgence of white movement among the Cossack groups, they are also agitating for Cossack autonomy. So again, that link is broken, as if to look back at the fall of the Tsar as the pivotal moment which underscores the evisceration of the right. And again, when I use right, it always has to be qualified by this sense of negation in terms of the right within Russia as representing some sort of coherent ideology. What I'm going to get into with this article is really representing the failure of an alternative to coalesce following from the fall of the Tsar, which is a consistent trend. I mean, when we look at the army, and as you mentioned regarding the liberal pretensions of someone like Alekseev, you can't consider these figures in 1918 and 1919 in the same way that you consider these figures in 1905, dealing with the Russian Revolution and reacting to the October Manifesto. And that's partly why I find it so fascinating, is the castration of ideology when it comes to this, the And this is what I want to get into with this article. And this article, which I've linked in the description, is the one by Christopher Lazarski, White Propaganda Efforts in the South during the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 1919. And again, as with the previous article, if either of you just want to interject at any point. After the October coup d'etat, Bolshevik authority rapidly spread throughout the country. The new regime, however, was able to hold the peripheries of the Russian Empire only temporarily and had to fight against a variety of local governments. And again, this is key to this idea, which I'm bringing up here about Moscow and the government of the Bolsheviks having usurped the mantle of the Third Rome as representing the core of a Russian territory. So the whites, such as they are constituted, have to reconcile themselves with being at once Russian nationalists and having to deal with these nationality struggles. So when looking at the right, say, for example, when looking at the Russian right, one has to look at these nations essentially as components within the Russian Empire. Yet at the same time, one could be on the right and one could be an anti-Russian nationalist, in the same way that one could be a Finnish nationalist, an Estonian nationalist, even a Ukrainian nationalist or a Cossack nationalist. The whole variety of taking Russian nationalism and then dissolving the Russian nation and having the Russian core relocated into Muscovy in the central area around Russia. All of this does is complicate the picture of the Russian right vis-a-vis orthodoxy, nationalism, and the localities, to the point where I almost see this picture. And unless there was some sort of coup within the Russian core itself, I believe the white movement was doomed to begin with. I mean, as Marcus, you can clearly see, this article is focused around Denikin and Wrangel. But if you look at this map, there is an obvious division between the Ukrainian Belarusian Caucasus front and the area around the Don, and of course the wars going on in Poland, the Baltic, and Finland. And then, of course, you see the Eastern Front, which is almost completely detached. And I mean, what really is culturally there, apart from the existence of a Russian state to override these territories, to link these two things together if there is no physical link, as with the existence of the Russian Empire? And indeed, of course, this is an area which is relatively backward. There's very little in the way of infrastructure. They have to maintain these vast fronts. And of course, there is another thing which I need to mention, of course, which is the Czech Legion contingent, which is this bizarre instance where you have Czech nationalists who are fighting against the Austrians. They are appropriated by the French and the Russians. But now, of course, you have this Czech Legion, which have been essentially created under the auspices of fighting for the Entente, and now they are a rogue element participating in the Russian Civil War. But with that point, I'm just going to continue with this article.
Can I just quickly mention something just there?
Yeah.
Two things. One, and through the majority of this journey, they're actually still carrying with them or taking along along behind them their Austrian POWs, which they've captured throughout the fighting. And the second thing is that for those who aren't familiar with the Czech Legion, it is truly, truly, truly one of the most interesting and enthralling adventures of the 21st century of a fighting force, literally marching itself across a continent. I just want to put that in there because the Czech Legion stories, I don't know about it in depth. I've read about it here and there, but it is a fascinating story. I just want to say that much.
Complete with a gold heist.
In the South in 1917 to 18, at least a dozen such governments resisted Soviet power, each representing different, often contradictory social interests and regional or national aspirations. The volunteer army of General Alekseev was by no means the most important or legitimate alternative to the Soviets in the South, nor was it regarded as such. At the same time, this army, as the only anti-Bolshevik center in the South, had clear all-national goals and claimed to be the only heir to legitimate all-Russian authority. With this perspective, it insisted on the continuation of the war with Germany as a task equally important to the fight against the Bolsheviks. It also opposed not only separatism, but even regional particularism in the South, again focusing on this incompatibility of the area which the whites have found themselves in control of, and the fact that the Russians control the core.
Just one more thing quickly. Part of the thing that sort of lent them legitimacy in this regard was the ability to claim some kind of succession from the imperial army proper, and that's not just so mostly in terms of the officers, which is often talked about an army composed mainly of officers, but there were also a handful of units which managed to maintain cohesion and discipline despite all of the contradictory and confusing orders from above that made the rest of the army disintegrate. So notably the 3rd Cavalry Corps of the Northern Army, or the Western Army, I think it was actually called, but the army in the north, which then later became the unit that Pyotr Krasnov eventually commanded, and I can't remember what the size of the unit was, under Drozdovsky, I think is his name. I think is how you pronounce it. So, yeah, worth mentioning that the tattered remains of the Russian army do sort of converge into the volunteer army.
But do you think that goes a long way to explaining as to why they believe the fight against the Germans is still relevant, as well as the Bolsheviks, because they represent that core who are the most committed to the war?
Essentially, yes. That comes up a lot, but it's not a hard and fast sort of distinction, because there were plenty of people who were still willing to work with the Germans. Notably, I think Udinich's force comprised quite significantly of Germans, and coming up behind Yudenich, who probably would have either helped him or Keller's government in Kiev, was another army under Bergmont Avalov, who was very sort of Germanophilic and had a pretty sizable contingent under him as well. But considering, so his perspective of the situation in the West was such that the other forces did not actually need help from him, so he focused on trying to retake the Baltics. Obviously, that ends up being folly, but it's an interesting perspective.
Just to add to that point very quickly, not that he had many Germans under his command, because simply the sector that he commanded didn't sort of have any Baltic Germans or even German units in its proximity. But famously, Yevgeny Miller was also very pro-German in this context as well. He did support Yudenich in those endeavors, for example.
With the passing of time, the movement became more rigid in this respect, increasingly alienating the Cossacks who composed the majority of the army. Furthermore, the volunteer army rejected any definite predetermination of the social, economic, and political order for a future Russia, and this also should be noted at a time when the Bolsheviks had a very clear, predetermined plan. This meant that the movement could neither deliver the peace and the land that the people, the Rod, wanted, nor unequivocally guarantee the democracy and freedom that the educated society, the Общество, desired. An equally important negative element was the army's behavior on the white-controlled territory. Although the re-establishment of law and order was high in Denikin's priorities, the army frequently brought even more lawlessness and disorder to an already fragmented society. It was often argued by the whites themselves, and still by some historians, that these factors severely handicapped anti-Bolshevik propaganda work and offered excellent material for red agitation. This opinion seems to overlook the analogous difficulties which confronted Bolshevik propaganda. War communism as an ideology did not possess popular appeal, and again, this is referring back to what you mentioned, Marcus, about Trotsky and extreme mobilization. Since deluded to mass terror and requisitions, it quickly antagonized the population within its reach. As to the Red Army, it did not... Yeah.
One additional quick point on that, actually. There's a certain irony in that war communism actually failed as an economic policy so catastrophically that for many in the cities especially, the only way to actually put food on the table, get money to put food on the table, was to actually join the Red Army.
It did not conduct itself any better than the volunteers, and the white propaganda took full advantage of these factors by using the threat of communal property and abuses of power by the Red Commissars as one of its main themes. The volunteer army never controlled information and propaganda in its territories to the degree achieved gradually by the Bolsheviks. Prior to the foundation of the OSVAK in September 1918, the whites were not even in a position to do it. Furthermore, the white movement became the dominant anti-Bolshevik force only in the winter of 1918-1919. Their propaganda efforts, therefore, especially in the early period, have to be seen as part of a larger anti-Bolshevik campaign coming from various sources. After the initial chaos in the spring of summer 1918, the pro-German governments of Ukraine and the Don established themselves as anti-Bolshevik centers, stronger than the volunteer army itself. Many Russian patriots were ready to accept these separatist governments as their own authority because they considered Bolshevism to be a disastrous alternative. Again, the contradiction of Russian nationalism and anti-Bolshevism is one maintaining a social order, as one maintaining the continuation of a Russian empire.
One interesting point quickly on the inability of the whites to maintain sort of like the levels of censorship that the Reds were. While that is true, and while they probably didn't actually want to censor quite a lot of what was there, because they were always much more willing to work with the left than the right, there is an interesting wrinkle in certain cases of what the Reds were actually capable of achieving themselves at this time, because someone in the comments, I think it was in a super chat, mentioned Ivan Ilyin, and he was actually in Petrograd right up until, I believe it was 1922, and he was lecturing and writing very publicly, denouncing the Bolsheviks constantly. But yeah, he was basically left to his own devices, more or less, up until 1922, when he was eventually actually just deported, rather than what you'd associate with the Bolsheviks doing with that kind of a figure later on.
The propaganda of these anti-Bolshevik centers was pro-German, often separatist, and increasingly conservative and monarchist. Its positive goals, such as an independent Ukraine or decentralized Russia, contradicted white propaganda. But its negative side, namely the hatred of Bolshevism, was common to both. A similar disagreement on which the programs to adopt, combined with strong hostility towards the Bolsheviks, appeared later in the autumn of winter of 1918. Between the whites and the more liberal governments of Crimea and the Kuban. I need to also point out, again, in reference to previous conversations, that the idea of decentralization within Russia is part of a broader theme and problem with Pan-Slavism. Another reason as to, when looking at the Russian right and disassociating it with the idea of popular nationalism or great Russian chauvinism, as the Stalinists would refer to it as, is the idea that the nation is replacing the Tsar. And in that case, having a Tsar with certain privileged relations with the Cossacks and then by extension the Finns helps to prevent, you can say, the conquest of the Tsar by populist forces or nationalist forces, in the same way we're talking about the example of the French Revolution. The Tsar is at the head of an empire and the Russians are simply constituents of it, not over the Tsar. But of course this is conflicted with the idea that the Russian nationality is dependent on the Tsar at the same time. And this is the core, you could say, difficulty with the idea of orthodoxy and nationality, the idea of what does nationality mean within this great context. Because when looking at Pan-Slavic literature, one has to consider that decentralization, Pan-Slavism, and democracy was a consistent theme as part of this Pan-Slavic literature. So what would essentially be entailed by the desires of a decentralized Russia, you can say, had the whites in a very sort of obscure series of circumstances actually been able to win the war against the Bolsheviks, we could have seen something resembling that of the Ukrainian nationalists or proto-Ukrainian nationalists, Ruthenian nationalists, Pan-Slavists in the 19th century, which is the creation of a loose confederation of all of the Slavic groups, possibly under a figurehead who may have been part of the Romanov dynasty, but of course that's just pure speculation. The Russian language press and party organizations were also powerful sources of anti-Bolshevik propaganda. And also it should be noted that a decentralizing tendency at wartime isn't really conducive to a successful war effort. In late 1917, even in Bolshevik-controlled territory, the press inserted accurate information about the volunteer army. From 1918 onwards, the South experienced a proliferation of press publications in spite of paper shortages. There are no sufficient data for the entire region, but a sample from Kiev and its immediate vicinity illustrates the point. In the winter of 1918 to 1919, under inhospitable authority of the Ukrainian dictionary, which closed down some Russian language newspapers, the remaining 12 press organizations were still able to print 250,000 copies per day. Various Southern Party organizations carried out their own anti-Bolshevik propaganda by organizing meetings and public lectures, by issuing resolutions, protests, and appeals, and by publishing newspapers and leaflets. Some of them, such as the White Intelligence Service, Azbuka, and the National Center, supported the white cause unequivocally and propagated its aims, such as the Union for the Regeneration of Russia and the State Unity Council of Russia did, with certain reservations. Others, such as monarchist, industrial, and agricultural organizations, were perceived by the whites as unfriendly, though they often shared the same final goal, the restoration of the all-Russian state. Thus, white anti-Bolshevik propaganda, however modest in the early period, had to be amplified by the endeavors of various forces hostile to Bolshevik authority, and obviously with contrasting and often overlapping and censorious language regimes. Together, these efforts seemed strong enough to neutralize the influence of Bolshevik propaganda in the South that did not experience spontaneous Bolshevik uprisings after the initial stages of chaos. The swift spread of Bolshevik power after the October Revolution and the propaganda which accompanied it made a profound impression on the whites. The Bolshevik success appeared to them mainly the work of red propaganda machine making empty promises, disseminating lies, and exhorting the people to revolt against all natural order. White sources are full of complaints about the seemingly ubiquitous hostile propaganda and the absence of white counter-efforts. On the one hand, they claim that the Bolsheviks and even separatists devoted huge resources to conduct skillful, imaginative, and powerful propaganda. On the other, that the whites were incompetent, passive, and hopelessly outmaneuvered. Historians have taken these complaints at face value and used them as proof of white negligence and ineptitude in propaganda matters. A different perspective on such complaints can show, however, that another interpretation is equally plausible. The whites appear to have held highly unrealistic opinions on the power of propaganda, and they often try to explain away all problems, even the most fundamental, as a result of hostile agitation. For example, some reports attribute peasant passivity or enmity towards the government to inadequate response of white to Bolshevik propaganda. Pillages of the countryside by the army or Denikin's land policy seem to be less important. Other sources state that separatist movements in Ukraine and in the Cossack territories arose mainly as a result of subversive actions undertaken by the Germans, Bolsheviks, and regional nationalists. If the whites
Well, they're not. They're not exactly wrong on Ukraine there. So one interesting wrinkle of the emergence of Ukrainian nationalism at this time is the great rush of sort of Ukrainian or budding Ukrainian nationalists from what was Austrian or Austro-Hungarian Ukraine to back to Kiev and back to the formerly Russian Ukraine.
If the whites had been energetic and had developed agitation, says one report, everything could have changed their advantage. Inasmuch as hostile propaganda created severe problems, it was believed that white counteraction on a grand scale could have averted the situation. For example, in late autumn of 1918, after the Germans began their withdrawal from Russia, the white government asked the Western powers to dispatch immediately at least a token military force to the south as a sign of friendship. This, they said, would have had a profound propagandistic effect in itself on the southern population. Some politicians also expected the Allies to issue a proclamation condemning Bolshevism and declaring its leaders outlaws. They envisaged that this proclamation would be printed in billions of copies and disseminated by aeroplanes throughout Russia. Thus, to compete with its enemies, white propaganda sought to reach dimension much higher than even that which the Bolsheviks accomplished, or as the author of another proposition put it, the propaganda program to be carried out according to American methods. And again, I'm reminded of the hopeless Allied leafleting campaign during the Phony War. Critics of white propaganda work often contradicted themselves in a way which reveals their prejudice against OSVAG rather than the true flaws of the agency. Some accused it of limiting its activity to the front lines while neglecting villages. Others saw no propaganda effort at the front and complained that OSVAG only worked in towns. Still others did not see any activity in towns except for window exhibits which displayed some posters and OSVAG prints. OSVAG's hiring standards were criticized as either being too strict or too loose, that the agency employed either leftists or Black Hundred reactionaries, either Jews or anti-Semites. The search for scapegoats by the leadership at all levels of the white administration was also a factor in white dissatisfaction with their propaganda. Denikin, doubtlessly the person most responsible for creating exceptionally unfavorable conditions for white propaganda, was the first to denounce OSVAG performance. He saw more harm than merit in its work, and so did his subordinates. Corrupt and indolent army officers and administrative officials whose conduct greatly damaged the white cause grew accustomed to blaming propaganda for the effects of their own wrongdoings. In those circumstances, no propaganda, however ingenious, could be deemed as satisfactory. Lastly, it is worthwhile to compare the problems of white propaganda effort with those of its red counterpart. Peter Kenez, a specialist in Bolshevik and white propaganda matters, accumulated ample evidence showing that the Reds were dissatisfied with their propaganda work during the Civil War, perhaps as much as the Whites. Like the Whites, they complained that leaders paid too little attention to propaganda. Written propaganda suffered from paper shortages and low technical quality. Newspaper rarely reached local party organizations and were completely unavailable in the countryside. Editors and journalists were undereducated. Articles were dull and did not reflect local affairs. Agitators focused their works in towns and avoided villages. At the same time, the Red tended to overestimate the strength of white propaganda. For them, it was the Whites who were imaginative, clever, dangerous propagandists who could undermine Soviet authority. The first white propaganda efforts were as humble as the origins of the army itself. Having established army headquarters, sorry, before I continue, is there anything anyone wants to comment?
Yeah, I mean, the overriding impression is, to a great degree, failure looking for a cause, to an extent. I mean, I know with this, one of the other things that I've mentioned and sort of harped on a little bit is the fact that the Whites in general are a much more liberal movement than we are often led to believe, and they would much rather generally cooperate with the left and try and appease the left rather than appeasing the right. And so that may go some way towards explaining why they didn't care about the villages, because quite often the villages were sort of more genuinely sympathetic towards the right.
Well,
But,
I wouldn't say it's even a matter of them being sympathetic towards the right. I think it's just an absence of political mobilization. I think I mean, the way that socialists look at certain classes of people, they rate them in terms of potential political agitation. And consistently among Orthodox proponents of Marxist agitation, they look at the peasantry as nothing more than a feudal throwback, nothing more than a reactionary element. But of course, you can be even more scathing than that and say the peasantry have no genuine political element whatsoever. And if they lack any sort of political mobilization, then they're completely sort of irrelevant in terms of a grand scheme of political action. So a failure to provide a concrete ideology to mobilize the peasants, even say, for example, the simple premise of the kulaks protecting their land or not starving, which is a rather clear message, is not communicated unambiguously. And in the same way that when we look at the consistent trends throughout not just the white movement, but all anti-Bolshevik movements, from movements of national independence to hardcore czarists to disaffected Mensheviks, it is a fundamentally negative movement. They cannot provide an alternative. They cannot provide a basis for a future in the absence of the Bolsheviks. And indeed, this has been the consistent failure of all such organizations since the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. And you can say that this failure to create positive conditions for the future had already started during the reign of Nicholas II. All you instead had were these lofty ambitions for conquest, while Russian society was disintegrating. So it really is sort of quite sort of incredible to consider how the forces that were so antithetical to Russia and to Russian society and to all of life which existed up to that point were the ones with the greatest level of political awareness vis-a-vis which populations needed to be mobilized, and obviously the most coherent political ideology and the greatest level of political discipline, as augmented by Sovnarkom and Lenin's leadership, personal leadership in this.
You have anything to say, Rupert? Or shall I
yeah, I was just going to say much better phrased. I was a little bit sloppy in what I actually meant by that. But yeah, they were definitely very politically unengaged generally, somewhat by design of the autocracy. But yeah, I mean, to sort of bolster that point about the incompetence a little bit more, one of the chronic lacks, or one of the chronic shortages two of the chronic shortages, I suppose, that the white movement, especially in the South, has is food and manpower, and both of which obviously would have been much augmented if they'd actually had proper cooperation from the countryside.
But just to build on that peasant point again, in terms of, because of course the fantasy of the late Russian Empire was the mystical bond between, again, the peasantry as representing the black millions and the Tsar himself. And this link is not only political, it's also supposed to be mystical. And again, when you look at the emancipation and you look at the Stolypin reforms, it is all about cement. And even if you look at the land captains of Alexander III, all of these reforms are aiming at potentially building that relationship between the Tsar and the peasant. But of course, I think as we've seen demonstrably proven over and over again, eliminate the Tsar, and that entire relationship is completely bungled. And what are you left with? What is there to mobilize the peasants in the absence of this relationship, which was, you can say, almost painstakingly cultivated in that previous era? Because when we're talking about fidelity to the Tsar, we're not talking about political agitation. We're talking about unity to a conception of government headed by a particular figurehead. Remove that figurehead, you can't simply take a ersatz form of a supposed ideology, which itself is quite antithetical to the nature of monarchism, and build it around another group. And this is the failure of the whites, is to find something to replace it. And it's even the failure to find a Tsar figure who would then be that rallying figure for all the peasants to come and to fight for, essentially. Because in Ekaterinburg, in July of 1918, the royal family are eliminated. And the Reds then go on and try and murder every single Romanov they can get their hands on. And the vestiges of the Romanov dynasty go into exile, mainly into Germany. And so you are left with these pale imitation figures like Denikin and like Kolchak, who never establish complete control over their own respective factions, let alone recognition in Russia or international recognition.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with the peasantry is, as far as I can tell, not one of disloyalty per se, but one of organization. And so, yeah, the ability to organize the peasantry is just not properly, politically speaking, that is just not established prior to when it's needed. So the removal of the Tsar is just the complete destruction of the possibility of the peasantry to actually take part in politics, although they hadn't done that at all prior either. So not the best way of framing it, but yeah, there was just no infrastructure there for them to really get involved. But also interesting to note that not only did a lot of the Romanovs go to Germany, but quite a lot of the actual Russian right does go to Germany, and later on they actually have a lot more success there than back in Russia, which is a data point that I think has some implications. But maybe we'll come back to that. And just as one final point, I believe it's actually not until 1923, 24, possibly even 25, when the Romanovs amongst themselves actually select a successor, and that's sort of part of the problem as well, is that if they'd actually been able to get their act together and decide who the successor to who the legitimate successor to Nicholas II was going to be, then perhaps there would have been something to attach to. But as was, they just didn't.
Can I just come in with a minor point here at some point?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Or actually, do you want to answer Rupert first, and I'll come in, AM, because I think we got to reply to that.
No, I obviously you have the fundamental law regarding succession that was instituted by Pope Paul to ensure that a woman would never become the head of state of Russia ever again. So it was actually pretty obvious, following on from the descendants of Alexander II. I'm just going to look up the name because it temporarily escapes me.
Kirill, I think.
Kirill of Russia, who should have again represented that mantle.
But I think part of the problem is that there was somebody who was theoretically ahead of him in line, but was unsuitable due to having cooperated with the socialists to some degree. I think cooperated with the Bolsheviks particularly. And that might have been Grand Duke Michael.
And but Grand Duke Michael was assassinated only a couple of days after the elimination of the royal family, so it wouldn't have taken. I'll have to look more into this issue regarding why it took so long for them to essentially waited until the Bolsheviks were in an unassailable position before they decided to announce a candidate, which seems preposterous. But anyway, Marcus.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. I might chime in here with, just because we're sort of touching on this issue of, organization the organization of the Reds the general disorganization of the white forces, is that on one hand you have, or rather, what we historically see is an interesting distinction between the sort of mechanistic operation of these two forces. One aspect of it is almost culture downstream from the ideology itself. Second is a question of leadership, and then third is in fact a question of geography. And it's good that you got this map here, because I'll use that to explain the third point, which I think I'll even start with, and I'll work backwards. Is that the advantage of the Reds is an ironic one, because in sort of most cases pertaining to warfare, you don't want to be surrounded by your enemy, particularly on all sides. But in this particular instance, it is actually an advantage, strangely enough, because by controlling this center, like you say, AM, that it sort of roughly corresponds with this historical Duchy of Muscovy before it sort of becomes, the nascent Russian state, is that it physically and geographically separates the supreme leader of Russia, in this case Kolchak, from all the other commanders. And even the other commanders although for a time, certainly, in certain places, share a contiguous front. Miller, Yudenich, Denikin, Wrangel, etc. But they are so far spread apart by geography, and obviously by having the enemy in between them, the ability to maintain contact with each other and even amongst themselves is difficult. The Reds, meanwhile, have this plump, contiguous territory in this sort of Western European part of Russia that has the largest concentrations of population. They have the largest concentration of, what modern industrial, construction and development have been taking place under the auspices of the Tsars leading up to and including the war. Most of this has occurred in places such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kharkiv, Voronezh, Smolensk, Minsk, etc. And from a standpoint of transportation, if you even look at like a World War II image illustration of railway lines that traverse Russia, basically, in so long as the power that be in question controls, Moscow, Astrakhan, St. Petersburg, and, a couple of these other key cities, you can go in any direction that you wish. And if you don't control those rail lines, getting anywhere else around Russia is supremely difficult. And so the Reds have this geographical advantage where they can respond to threats on any given front very rapidly. They don't have compromised contact, because each each element of the Red Army that might be deployed, and even amongst government officials and local, sectors of red government, shall I call it, can communicate with each other and amongst themselves with relative ease via the whites. And also I've already mentioned population, and see the whites have the inverse problem, is that Kolchak, yes, he dominates a lot of area, but it's this vast expanse of Siberia. Sort of Denikin and Wrangel are sort of concentrated in the south, whereas, yes, there's a bit of population there, yes, there's a little bit of industry, yes, that's the location of the Black Sea Fleet. But again, it's hard to coordinate with Yudenich, it's hard to coordinate with Miller. And so it's a case of each of these white forces are so disparate that they can't even coordinate properly. And even the organization amongst themselves, for instance, one of Kolchak's leading generals, Kapel, is one of the more successful generals, and he pushes up. I think they capture, it's not Omsk. I think it's after they capture Omsk. Anyway, they capture a handful of cities west of Omsk, but essentially these forces start to run short of supplies. They start to run short of munitions. And it's at that point where sort of Kapel is pushing in the north, they get counterattacked in the south, and units start to, once they're pushed back far enough, some units start to defect to the Reds. And because the front is so large and so thinly spread out, they can't even really coordinate themselves properly. And by the time Kolchak actually announces the retreat back to, well, firstly to Omsk, and then secondly to Itovsk, where eventually it's en route to Itovsk that he's captured by the Soviets and executed. But controlling this part of Russia is difficult. Communicating through this part of Russia is difficult. And it's actually interesting I mentioned Omsk, because before he arrives in Russia, the Reds sees it. The Reds sees it, and then the local Cossacks and Whites sort of capture it off them. And then once Kolchak arrives, it changes hands once more. And a city such as Omsk, which actually for a time is Kolchak's seat of power, more or less, it changes hands, I think 5 times or 6 times throughout the course of the Russian Civil War. So it should be indicative of just, the sheer scale and difficulty for both parties, but especially for the whites. So that was a bit tangential, but I figured it was important given the map was here and that we've talked about organization. Actually, sorry, I know you've unmuted, but just the last point I want to talk about is Lenin. And as much as he may be evil, he's an evil genius for good reason. And if you look at the way that sort of Lenin obsessed about the revolution and had this planned in his head for a very long time and mulled over it for years, the kind of intellectual discipline that's required to do that is almost unthinkable, even to people like us. And therefore, it could be rightly presumed that people whom surrounded Lenin and people who answered to Lenin were, shall I say, of a similar note, or rather had, Lenin would expect similar of them, whether it was, say, Trotsky, who commanded the Red Army, for instance, or whether it was, Stalin or, Bukharin and these other sort of functionaries in the party, that kind of, energy would, and also given the zeal that the Bolsheviks did actually demonstrate, whether it was in Russia, whether it was the Spartacus uprising in Germany, whether it's the Bavarian movement in 1918 under Radek, there's a great deal of energy and fervor amongst these Bolshevik movements, and there's something to be said for that is sort of what Napoleon would call the intangible, like the unquantifiable aspect of warfare, and that the ability to be sort of energetic in this way would also improve the effectiveness of how this rebellion and as a nascent state works. And that for all these people who are involved in this, in organizing this, this rebellion, even if they're, not particularly talented, they're competent. Or sorry, if they're not particularly talented, they're at least, efficient at a task as a functionary. And if they're not particularly, efficient themselves, they're at least, bold and energetic in whatever aspect of the revolution they're participating in. And maybe with the Reds, with the whites comparatively, there's not that same vigor. There's more this ideal of we've lost something which we're trying to restore, or we're trying to defend something that we hold dear. Whereas there's a lot more sort of intellectual and, dare I say, spiritual energy on the other side. And I don't know whether that particularly matters, but it's just that,
no, that's a good
difference between
segue.
these forces are interesting. Sorry,
That's a good segue, and I just want to use that opportunity because it fits in quite nicely, just to read one last segment before I move on from this. Since Russia held greater motive value for whites, their main propaganda themes usually had national overtones. Thus, the Bolsheviks were presented not as true Russians, but as German agents, whose majority was Jewish. Germany wanted to dismember Russia and use Bolshevism and separatism as instruments to achieve that war goal. It continued to assist the Soviet regime even after the Lost War. Hence, the fight against the Bolsheviks was a basic patriotic duty incumbent on all Russians. Everything that hindered the struggle, such as social, political, and especially regional interests, was considered to be treason. A parallel theme was that the Bolsheviks as German agents preached the slogan of class struggle within the nation. This teaching awoke the darkest forces among the people and led to the Civil War. The Bolshevik message of social justice and that of Marxism in general was a lie. Instead of land for the peasants, they brought communes and food requisitions. Instead of peace, they incited a war among the Russians, capable of destroying wealth accumulated after ages of hard work. Instead of freedom, they brought a sinister tyranny which threatened to throw Russia back from civilization into barbarism. In this context, the whites exploited the problem of Soviet crimes as one of the most important themes of their propaganda. Newspaper pamphlets, posters spread news about summary executions, tortures, desecrations of churches committed by the Bolsheviks. And it should be mentioned that the Bolsheviks killed in any way between around 15,000 priests, but I'll get into the Orthodox angle in a second. They also contained information about the problems of cold, hunger, and more generally the incredible hardship of life under the Soviet regime. As far as positive messages of white propaganda are concerned, the main themes are the salvation of Russia, 1. Indivisible land, law, order, and white territory, civil liberties, and the determination of the future of Russia by the Constituent Assembly. Despite the view of traditional historiography, these national and political slogans often made for effective propaganda, even among the workers. Propaganda also stressed the social progressive nature of the white regime. Hence, it made wide use of 2 Denikin March letters of the Special Council promising land reform and labour legislation. This, if anything, should emphasise why the whites failed and the reds won, because the future to be determined by the Constituent Assembly with these vague overtures to Russian nationalism, anti-Bolshevism, and potential social progressivism. These are not the sort of causes which, other than some nebulous association with Russia, which is, as we see, Russia proper is already occupied by the Bolsheviks. And so in many ways, they are revolting against the Russian Empire because the Soviet Union would effectively assume that mantle, that they cannot inculcate in their followers this idea of the fanatical desire for the propagation of the proletarian revolution, combined with that discipline and regimented party hierarchy based essentially on the lines of a professional vanguard of revolutionaries to bring this about. All of that was absent. And again, all of this, we need to win the war, then we'll think about the future, rather than having a positive message, one that is fundamentally based around the crimes of Bolshevism and this nebulous notion around treason, when of course most of your allies in this regard are already thinking and actively pursuing the dismantling of the Russian Empire as that existed. So it really should come as no surprise as to why the whites lost. But the only thing I really want to, just for you to quickly summarize, Marcus, is the end of Kolchak and the elimination of the last vestiges of the whites. And Rupert, of course, comment, if you will, on that as well.
I mean, I sort of touched on it already. I mean, what sort of begins to happen is that because the Reds they possess the majority of Russian industry, they're able to actually, to some degree, sustain themselves. And of course, as we know, there are elements of the West that are sympathetic to the Bolshevik cause. And so, you know, by the latter half of the Civil War, the Russians, the Reds are better equipped. They have better logistics. They have access to more material, and they also have, in, like I said, about the nature of their geographical sort of predicament. You know, they are able to send reinforcements to any front more readily and more easily. And you know, there sort of comes a tipping point, and I did touch on Kapel's push from Omsk and in the northern part of the eastern sector, and they just overextend, and this is sort of in the dead of winter, and you got to think, you look at this map here, where Vladivostok is, which, if, I mean, I'm assuming most people know, but on this map, you sort of see a few blue lines converge just on the border with China at the bottom of the map, the seaports. That's where Vladivostok is. And then the Trans-Siberian Railway sort of follows China all along there and sort of into sort of central Siberia. And I mean, Omsk is and Tursk are both on that Trans-Siberian Railway. I mean, that is a tremendous distance by which to try and send, you know, munitions and reinforcements and supplies and even uniforms, all that sort of stuff. And so essentially it was almost a case of logistics broke down in concert with the inability of these various white generals and their respective forces to plan and to carry out operations in coordination and sort of in unison. Arguably, I would say to my limited knowledge, Wrangel and Denikin in sort of that Caucasus Ukrainian front probably come the closest to really, really threatening the red cause. And, you know, and for instance, you know, there's 4 battles of Kiev, there's 4 battles of Kharkiv. I believe Voronezh changes hands a couple of times. So, and essentially, had Denikin and Wrangel succeeded, you can even see on this map here, along that the confluence of the Volga there sort of gets close to the Don, and then it sort of heads north again. That push in 1919 by Kolchak's forces westwards from the east, and Denikin and Wrangel pushing up, basically where sort of modern day Volgograd or Stalingrad is. Those two parts of the White Front almost come together, but the Reds managed to keep them separate. And then anyway, sort of, you know, Kolchak is pushed eastwards and his forces. I keep mentioning Kapel because Kapel is one of his more generals. Suffers. He dies through exposure because, I mean, Siberia in the winter is a terrible experience, as the German army would find out later. And then, of course, as he retreats eastwards and he attempts to relocate his administration or his government to Itursk, Itursk is seized by the Reds, and in order for the Czechoslovak Legion to ensure its own safety and return back home, again, I may be wrong here, but my understanding is that they agree to turn over Kolchak, and they hand him over to the sort of this provisional Soviet, what they call it, this local workers' Soviet assembly in Itursk, and he's imprisoned for a few days and then eventually executed by the Soviets, as his like the chief of the government. The man's name escapes me for the moment. And of course, Denikin and Wrangel end up being sort of pushed out of the Caucasus. They're pushed out of the Kub Peninsula. They're pushed out of the Donbass. They retreat to Crimea. To which point, actually, the Crimea becomes arguably the last strong point of actual resistance. I think by the time the forces in Crimea are dealt with by the Reds, I mean, Wrangel has assembled something in the order of 50,000 infantry and nearly 20,000 cavalry, and possesses the sizable remnant of the Balkan Sea fleet. I mean, he could have arguably fought on in Crimea for rather longer, but at that point, the Reds could just turn everything against them. And of course, eventually, in the north, Yudenich is forced to retreat through, as I mentioned before, through Estonia back into the Baltics, and sort of eventually, disperses his troops because they're not able to partake in any warfare with Estonia and the Baltic countries having declared independence anyway. And ultimately, in the north, Yevgeny Miller is forced to retreat as well. And what's interesting is that they have rather different fates in that I believe Yudenich has absolutely almost no influence or sway or even activity in any of these sort of post-Civil War emigre organizations that spring up after the Civil War. Wrangel is idolized, as is Denikin for that matter, because with the death of Kolchak, they're probably the two most senior people after Kolchak, because he's obviously killed by the Soviets. And Yevgeny Miller's kind of strange because he's not considered a leader in the same breadth of Denikin or Wrangel, but he's definitely the most agitated and the most energetic in that sphere of emigres who, are attempting to formulate ways of wanting to, fulfill this dream of restoration. And actually, I mean, I don't know if I can spoil the party, but essentially, Yevgeny Miller is one of the people whom the NKVD target to assassinate prior to World War II, because Yevgeny Miller is seen as a key figure that if someone of that emigre background could cooperate then at that point with the Third Reich and the Wehrmacht, it would be Yevgeny Miller, and he's actually captured and killed by the Soviets in the lead up to World War II, which is an interesting little fact. But yeah, is that a good enough summary, AM? Because I don't really have much else to contribute.
I mean, that's in terms of a tentative continuity. There was, of course, an attempt by Venizelos to get the Greek minority based in Mariupol out with Denikin, and therefore he assisted the evacuation from the Crimea in terms of trying to come up with a tentative link. And of course, this then playing
even though
a role,
the Greek situation was death itself,
playing a role later in Soviet Entente relationships, and of course the Turkish situation. But that isn't the definitive ending of the Whites. I mean, there are pockets in northern Siberia that hold out until the last pocket is eliminated in 1923, and then of course there is the international intervention, which is to consider as well. Ironically, Churchill is going to be one of the last holdouts from the Western Entente powers. Obviously, the French and the Americans have already sort of not made their peace, but have acquiesced to the idea that the Soviets are going to win. And fundamentally, the intervention was less driven by genuine anti-Bolshevism. For Churchill, who wasn't prime minister at this point, he was war minister under David Lloyd George, it originally did mean that. but ultimately it was a way of pressuring the Soviets into honoring their international debt commitments. Effectively, it had monetary, and originally it was concerned with keeping the Russians in the war also against Germany. But when the war with Germany ended, it became about the Soviets honoring their debt commitments, which they had torn up during the early stages of the revolution. Of course, when it seemed that the Soviets were going to win anyway, sustaining a war with them would therefore be cost prohibitive. And of course, a couple of years later, David Lloyd George would attempt to reintegrate the Soviet Union back into the international system of finance by concluding a de facto trade treaty with them, which also Germany and Weimar do. But the last sort of holdout regarding the international intervention, of course, is Japan, who hold on to areas in the extreme Far East. I believe you'll probably be able to correct me on this, Rupert, until 1924, 1925.
I thought it was 1923 actually, but it might be 1924.
Yeah.
I was going to add about that they actually ended up cycling in something in the order of like 3/4 of their land army, I think.
And
some absurd quantity of troops ended up being present in the east, and it was actually lengthy enough, and I don't know, I guess in their minds permanent enough that they actually started setting up a Japanese diaspora in colonist diaspora in Vladivostok before they were obviously hastily evacuated later.
And of course, the vestiges of the White Movement, by and large, then went on to relocate in Harbin, which would later become collaborators with the Kwantung Army as well. So there is
In particular, they actually end up being used as essentially an auxiliary, sort of like police units.
It's especially the Russian fascists as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of finding some way of ending the White Movement, obviously the ones that don't depart west then become enmeshed in terms of the whole makeup of the Japanese Empire, following from the ultimately unsuccessful intervention by the Japanese when they ultimately decide to cut their losses and retreat. Now, I have another article planned, but we've run out of time, so I'm only going to go over the conclusion of this article. But essentially,
just quickly in terms of like the actual legacy of the Whites, you did mention the emigre communities that existed after the Civil War, but Wrangel in particular does try to maintain some semblance of military discipline even when they are sort of relegated to a civilian role. So the various military unions that were maintained did actually have a kind of maintenance of discipline kind of role, and they were also attempting to maintain a pseudo-military cohesion. So in that sense, they sort of try to maintain the spirit of the Whites for a fair bit longer.
Just some notes also on what happened to Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich. Sorry, very tired and pronouncing all these Russian names. He actually tried to collaborate with the provisional government in the hopes that he would surpass Michael as regent, but Michael was never confirmed legally dead due to the secretive way in which the Bolsheviks conducted his assassination after the Ipatiev massacre. And so he wasn't actually declared legally dead until 1924. It wasn't that there was a contention, it was simply they needed to ratify the fact that Mikhail himself had demised. And only then did Kirill tentatively adopt the idea of guardianship over the Romanov family, and only in 1926, when the Soviets were again unassailable, did he make the claim to be a autocrat and Tsar of all the Russias, at which point it was effectively a dead letter anyway. All right, so this article is the article is termed a contradictory and multifaceted relationship, and why I selected this article is because it serves as an interesting epilogue regarding the currents of orthodoxy throughout the Soviet Union and how they would later emerge in some form in the post-Soviet world. Because, of course, this is fundamentally a history of the Orthodox Commonwealth that it's only fitting, therefore, to end in terms of aspects of continuity, because we've talked about the political aspects in which they were all systematically eliminated. But obviously, the Orthodox Church in Russia was not eliminated despite the avowed atheism and secularism of the Soviet state. Otherwise, there would be no Russian church today. So I'll just read the conclusion here. Conceived and perceived as the vanguards of the modern era, Bolshevism was imbued with a deep undercurrent of religion flowing throughout Russia's history. The repertoire of metaphors and beliefs from which the Soviet leaders drew consisted in no small measure of material whose vocabulary and grammar were, in many respects, those of traditional Orthodox symbolism. The cultural heritage of a religious nature helped shape the Soviet power structure and its relationship with Russian society. From the very outset, the Bolsheviks never concealed their intention to monopolize the sphere of the sacred. In order to achieve this, it was necessary to supplant the Orthodox Church in the historical task of the sacralization of politics, the symbolic mapping of the public space, and the interpretation of history and time. With respect to religious communities, and especially the Russian Orthodox Church, the only true obstacle to the monopolization of the sacred sphere, the ideological incompatibility of Bolshevism and Orthodox religion, manifested itself as a battle against religion that was fought with particular zeal. The history of Soviet Russia, above all between 1917 and 1939, saw an authentic war of symbols waged by the Bolsheviks with particular implacability against the Orthodox Church within the framework of broader anti-religious persecution. What was at stake was control over the sphere of the sacred, the relationship between power, religion, and the sacred, whose crucial importance for the political dynamics of Russia is still evident today, constitutes one of the key elements of 1917. While I have no intention of reopening the broad and complex debate of political religion about which so much has been written, and consideration of the religious dimension of 1917, therefore Bolshevism and the Soviet experiment as a whole, raises a significant question that is key to any real understanding of the history of the power structure and its relations with the society in Russia from the 20th century to the present. This issue will require historians of the contemporary era to undertake necessary, fruitful, and long-term consideration of the phenomena concerned. I will just mention on this point that obviously Nikon is enthroned as the first Russian patriarch in 200 years following the demise of the Tsar. And like I said, it is the collapse of the Tsar and all of the religious ideas wedded to the idea of the Tsardom, which in many ways creates the environment where the patriarch can rise again. But of course, it's a false dawn in the sense that the patriarch does not represent a fusion of spiritual and temporal authority, which would be necessary, you can say, to wrestle with the beast of Bolshevism. And instead, Patriarch Tikhon in particular has to make various overtures towards placability with the Soviet Union. In other words, drawing that thin line between preserving an element of the Orthodox Church and essentially collaborating with the Soviet Union so as to allow any element of the church to survive, or outright opposition, which would have entailed the dispossession of more essentially rights for the church, such as they were, and the killing of more priests. And as I mentioned, priests were killed by the Bolsheviks in order of thousands. Indeed, there is this consideration to what extent anything regarding the official operations of the Orthodox Church represented any authority that wasn't essentially being dictated to the church by Soviet ministries, effectively. In fact, there was an order, I believe, that to the international Orthodox community, because of course Russian Orthodoxy is an international organization beyond the simple confines of the Soviet Union, that anything emanating from the Soviet Union representing the Russian Orthodox Church should be ignored. And this diffusion of authority, of course, had its offshoot in the Rakor, the Russian Church in exile, which effectively created a schism, having just essentially created the Russian Patriarchate. So this leads to an incredibly complicated relationship, but obviously the fact the Soviet Union has to make peace with the fact that they are ruling over what is essentially the remnant of the Third Rome. There is one last point to mention, again back to the article. Graziosi points out how the view of 1917 in the 1930s under Stalin took on a new twist. The true meaning of the revolution was now the preservation of the Russian state tradition and state continuity, as the savior of which Stalin began to present himself. This implied the rediscovery of some of that state's traditions and heroes, great Tsars included. The continuity of the Russian state and the Russian history in general unquestionably constitutes another contradictory point of contact between the Orthodox reinterpretation of 1917, one developed in spheres that could be traced to the vast and varied field of Russian nationalism and statism as manifested in both Stalinist Russia and post-communist Russia over the last 2 decades. A sense of the historical continuity of the Russian state, even under the Soviet regime, was also found in the severely persecuted and beleaguered Orthodox world during World War II. During the last few years of fighting and the early post-war period, the defense of the homeland under attack was accompanied by the resumption of long-term geopolitical visions on the part of Stalin, whose objectives corresponded in many cases to the traditions and expectations of the Orthodox Church. At the same time, however, the rift opened by the revolution, followed by the Bolshevik persecution, could not be fitted into the framework of continuity. During the 1990s and early 2000s, some Orthodox intellectuals who were last inclined to accept any vision of Russian history, including the Soviet experience, launched a lively debate on the continuity of the power structure in Russia and proposed the restoration of a succession in legal, historical, and cultural terms, with pre-revolutionary Russia seen as the cornerstone of authentic rebirth. The unresolved and dramatically ambiguous question of the paradigm of Russian state continuity, often referred to in ecclesiastical discourse, has also resulted in a complicated, contradictory, and multifaceted relationship between the complex Orthodox world and 1917 and its consequences in all their multiplicity. And that is the end of Orthodoxy, Autocracy, and Nationality after over 2 years. So all I will say before we get to the super chats is, do either of you have any remarks you would like to make in summation for anything popping out of the stream? Marcus, would you like to go first?
I was going to wait for Rupert because I was probably going to make a more broad observation about the story of OAN generally, because like you said, it's been a 2-year voyage of sorts, and it'd be nice, I suppose, in a way to reflect on the scale of this. If you think that, quite some time ago, you, myself, and Columbus started this subject, actually discussing Bronze Age Greece, and the ethnogenesis of the Greek people and the Greek civilization, and we end that very long and enduring tale that has an arc over thousands of years, to where we look at the defeat of the Greek army after World War I at the hands of the nascent Turkish state, the Kemal Ataturk's forces in Anatolia. And indeed, the Third Rome suffers a terrible fate itself, with Russia being torn asunder with the Bolshevik Revolution. And I don't know, I figured it was a poignant just to reflect on that and the the great sort of narrative arc that sort of occurs over that vast time period. We inevitably confront Rome, and then we get to the Eastern Empire and the Crusades. The fall of Constantinople itself is dramatic, and the survival of the Greeks under the Meleti Room, under the guise of the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, and surviving under the Ottoman Empire, the Fanariotes, etc. And this Third Rome comes into materializes it. And you mentioned at the start of the stream, actually, firstly the intermarriage. I believe it was during the reign of John Zimisces, with the initial princes of the prince of the Kievan Rus, Vladislav, if memory serves me correct, and then of course there's the niece of the last emperor marries into the Russians once more and creates this Third Rome continuity. And I know it's a bit of a people probably roll their eyes at this reference, but Rome was a city built on 7 hills, Constantinople was a city built on 7 hills, and Moscow was a city built on 7 hills. And here we are.
So was Kiev, I think, actually.
Journey. Pardon?
So was Kiev, I think, actually.
Oh, maybe. There you go. I didn't know that. But there you go. We have reached the end of that journey. Now, I just want to pass on my thanks. Firstly, AM, to for you asking me to join. It's been a great exercise in the passion of history and for telling this great story. And I hope my contributions have been valuable. And it's been good to talk with yourself and Columba and our other guests. We've obviously had Semigog on, and we've had Rupert join us here at the end for a couple, and it's been magnificent. So thank you to yourself, Mr. Majesty, and thank you to our audience.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for those very kind comments. Rupert, anything you would like to say specifically about the stream or anything about the series, I guess?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. at the tail end. It's been quite the journey. I've been following along mostly as a viewer until now, but yeah, glad to have joined you for the last one. What strikes me, especially at this final stage, is well, something that I've tried to emphasize, I suppose, because it's something that jumps out to me very strongly about this latter period, is just the lack of inevitability to it. I do very much see just a handful of things going slightly differently, and we haven't mentioned all of them, but there were a couple of other instances where the Bolshevik movement could have just been sort of strangled in the crib, as it were, but just for a variety of reasons, it just never quite happened. So yeah, to sort of get to the stage where this long epoch sort of comes to an end during as a result of a series of happenstance sort of decisions and well, rather tragic happenings, is elevates the whole tragedy of the period, I would say.
Well, I mean, the irony, because unless I'm sort of looking at this through a rather teleological point of view, I'm not really that teleological at all when coming to history. I'm always engaged in the counterfactuals. And regarding this, what I find is rather ironic is this being the end of Orthodoxy, Autocracy, and nationality, is again the possibility of the Tsar realizing some sort of grand conquest, realizing the recapture of Constantinople, the opening of the Straits, that we are on the cusp of, you can say, the culmination of all of the projects which were delineated in previous streams. And had Tsar Nicholas II been a more competent Tsar, a more resolute Tsar, then there is a possibility that Russia, had it simply been allowed to continue with its industrialization project, been able to mobilize, say, for example, as many men as Stalin would later during the Second World War, could have realized all of these ambitions. Alas, I'm going to qualify that I believe Tsar Nicholas II was integral in terms of losing all of these opportunities that were handed to him, taking the legacy of Alexander III, which really was the Russian Empire at its height, and squandering all the opportunities given to him, not just on the Western Front, but also on the Eastern Front, regarding blundering into the Russo-Japanese War and blundering into the First World War as well, when had Russia simply waited and being able to reap the gains of the reforms made by Stolypin, continued its industrialization campaign at a time where there was so much in the way of foreign capital coming into Russia at the same time, and Russia was becoming all the more essential in terms of propping up the British Empire due to their diplomatic revolution in 1904 through to 1907. And essentially the Tsar was given every opportunity to build upon the legacy of his predecessor, the unshakable autocrat and the peacemaker, and he squandered all of it. And I find it really rather remarkable that we're talking about the end of this series, when in reality it could have been the culmination as opposed to the decimation of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, towards the end of the war for them, they have increased their industrial production, particularly in terms of basic industrial goods and armaments, by somewhere between like 3 and multiplied it by 3 and 7 times. They end the war with still a pretty sizable treasury in terms of hard specie. They actually have enough money to throw around that they're able to pay upfront cash, essentially, for rifle contracts in America and all sorts of things like that Stalin could perhaps only dream of later. So yeah, in a lot of ways, I do think it's sort of handled better than the USSR, but to some degree, the results speak for themselves.
And do I recall that the Russians had the largest gold reserve at this time in the world?
Oh yeah, at the start, and I think also at the end of the war, and it ends up being sort of scattered around, stolen in part by the Czechs, but some of it is grabbed by the initially it's grabbed by the white movement under Kolchak, and that's never quite turned into success on the ground, as it were, or a functioning economy. Or perhaps, as I sort of intimated earlier, perhaps part of their problem was that their economy was still too functional, whereas the Reds had inherited all these population centers, could decisively crushed the industrial economy in particular, so that the actual industrial output was something like had dropped by between 75 and 80% since a year prior to their attaining power. And put a lot of people out of work so that the only thing they could do is soldiering.
So I'll just quickly get to the super chats. Was Rasputin from a antinomian Siberian cult? Well, that was one of the many accusations held against him. To be honest, I would have to do my own sort of dedicated Rasputin episode, because I don't have an opinion on Rasputin, to be honest, because the myth supersedes the legend. And when I talk about Rasputin in the context of this series, I'm only referring to him in the context of essentially what others perceived him as, in terms of his residual political importance, but not in terms of the man himself and what he represented. So I'll have to look into that further, because, like I said, honestly, I don't have an opinion on him.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of sort of conflicting accounts. I think generally the myth of Rasputin is significantly more important than the actual man himself. Would be my general conclusion. Having read in particular Vasiliev, who gives a fairly myth-busting account of the man.
MB for $5 just says, thank you for the stream. Well, thank you very much. Orion for $2. Will you talk a bit about Ivan Ilyin, the stream? And that was the super chat you referenced much earlier in the stream, I believe, Rupert.
Indeed, yeah.
Rafael Iglesias de Figueiredo.
Well, actually, it's potentially worth holding on Ivan Ilyin a little bit more, because he's an interesting character for perhaps being indicative of some portion of the right, in that he initially is quite scathing towards the Tsar. I don't know whether he's sort of more liberally minded or more nationalist minded, but he initially celebrates the abdication of the Tsar, but then quickly comes to sort of see the error of his ways, perhaps, when he sees the way that the country goes and the way that Russia suffers in the wake of the loss of the Tsar. So he very quickly turns to a more, decisively in favor of the whites, and then eventually, after much troublemaking, as I mentioned in Petrograd, he's eventually evicted on I can't remember what it's called, but there's a ship full of troublesome academics that's all sent away from the Soviet Union in one go, and he's aboard that ship. But then he goes on to be a fairly prominent figure amongst the whites and perhaps even the chief ideologist of the whites or chief philosopher in Germany in particular. And he actually goes on to have a fairly significant impact on the German nationalist movement and the National Socialists.
Yes, he's the leading political thinker of the Russian All-Military Union, so part of Wrangel's unit as well, in the 5 years from 1924 until, when did Wrangel die? I'll just look it up quickly. I think it was 1928. So, yeah, but obviously that movement was then infiltrated by the Soviets. And then, I mean, Marcus and I actually talk about it quite extensively when we talk about the Waffen-SS Cossack contingents and the decimation of Cossack nationalism in Austria, of all places. So, yeah.
I mean, yeah, that is one thing I did want to mention, is that it's quite curious that a lot of these figures of the Russian right end up getting a lot more traction and having a great deal of influence on, especially the early National Socialists, but also just the German right in general, and sort of quite a lot of the texts that are produced by them are by the emigres are translated mostly into German and proliferated mainly in Germany. And so I think there is quite a lot of experience of the Russian Revolution, which is then sort of translated into political action in Germany and political thought in Germany. So that's quite an interesting topic to explore in itself.
Sorry, back to this super chat from Raphael for $10. Thank you very much, Raphael. Do you consider that the ethnic aspect of the Russian Orthodox Church makes it impossible for the Russian Empire to assume a Roman-like universality? Or is it possible through a universality of Christianity? Well, the Russian Orthodox Church did not consider itself an exclusively national church. Rather, when we talk about the Moscow Patriarchate, it was to establish predominance within the Orthodox community. Because like I said, that original predominance had been held by the Basileus of Byzantium, under which was, of course, the Patriarchate. But during Constantine XI, the Patriarchate is split between those favoring the Council of Florence and those favoring a rebuke of any overtures towards the West, which Constantine XI and John VIII agreed to on the contingent of Western support, which was forthcoming but wasn't exactly successful against the Ottomans. So it is not a question of establishing it's not basically a question of Anglicanism, even though elements of Peter the Great's reforms would basically reflect aspects, say, for example, of the Kirk in Scotland, and indeed aspects of Anglican subordination and the creation of a synod. Even though those were superficial attempts, the Russian Orthodox Church is not an Anglican church. It's really wrestling through superiority over the entire Orthodox communion. But the issue with the Orthodox Church is that it doesn't have an unambiguous universal head claiming universal spiritual dominion like the Pope in Rome. The Orthodox Church was never able to establish that. And even when you have the ecumenical patriarchate, it very much wants to try and, again, part of the reason for the schism is whether the Pope is a preeminent bishop or he claims a universal authority and infallibility that goes along with it, and indeed holds a spiritual authority which is preeminent above all temporal heads as well. So it's not just a conflict between the Eastern Church, and it's also a conflict with political heads in the Western Church as well. And I believe this is more as a sort of political differences stemming from the divided authorities between East and West, the Holy Roman Empire protecting and the Carolingians before them protecting the church, and indeed the differentiations between the Greek Rite and the Latin Rite, which were held together under the Romans, but of course dissipated when you have a divided political authority. So it does claim a universality, but nevertheless, the Patriarch of Moscow is you can say, the lesser of all the patriarchs within the Orthodox community, which is the irony here. He is simultaneously preeminent in many senses in terms of the diocese of which he claims authority over, yet at the same time he is a junior patriarch compared to the ancient patriarchs of Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and of course the Patriarch of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, who of course is the Pope. So it's a complicated question. Of course, the issue for what's happening with Orthodoxy in general is the question of autocephaly, the idea that all of these individual nation churches within the Orthodox communion are becoming more and more autonomous, and they're also conflicting authorities and communions within those various autonomous associations as well. It's really rather complicated to consider, and I'm not the best qualified person to talk about this because obviously I'm not Orthodox. I'm simply looking at this from the perspective of an outsider. But a recent example, say, is of the very public schism between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, and who has preeminence, because of course the Ukrainian Orthodox Church now is trying to claim a preeminence over the Muscovite Orthodox Church by the fact that Kiev was the original center of the cradle of Christianity in broader Rus civilization, and Moscow came later. And indeed, before the Metropolitan of Moscow, there was the Metropolitan of Vladimir Suzdal, and before the Metropolitan of Vladimir Suzdal, there was, of course, the Metropolitan of Kiev. I know it's very complicated, but such is the case when we're talking about the labyrinthine system that is the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church. Darth Kilhoun for $5. Just wanted to send some support since I cannot watch. I'll rewatch later. Well, thank you very much, Darth Kilhoun. Lady of Shalott for $5, 5 Australian dollars. Thank you very much. Solzhenitsyn wrote to the Bolsheviks, "You must understand they hated Russians and Christians. Bolshevism committed the greatest slaughter of all time." Well, Solzhenitsyn's primary view on all of this is that Bolshevism and the crimes of the Soviet Union came about because the Russians lost contact with God, which of course would be consistent with the idea that this was the end of Orthodoxy. But of course, as I just mentioned at the end, it wasn't quite the end. There was an aspect of continuity, a fraught continuity that should be emphasized, one that Stalin went a long way to try and rehabilitate. And indeed, you can say in the ways that Stalin tried to rehabilitate aspects of the Russian past, Putin, rather than taking the idea that there should be a complete separation from the Soviet Union in that past, is actually trying to take the premise of a Russia before the Soviet Union, and is trying to reconcile aspects of continuity with the Soviets as well, with what Russia means. So also the idea that Bolshevism committed the greatest slaughter of all time. I mean, they did commit a horrific slaughter, that should be said, but regarding the greatest slaughter of all time, that's up for debate. Marcus588 for $8 Australian. Thank you very much. Wonderful finish to OAN, gents. This was a series of doubtless tour de force. I'm sure I speak for all of us by saying we're very grateful for your efforts. Well, thank you very much, Marcus58. Rupert, do you want to say something?
Indeed, thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, regarding the sort of hollowing out of the of orthodoxy, I just thinking in line of this idea of orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. Obviously, we've been looking at the fall of autocracy here in particular, and orthodoxy as well. But we've sort of discussed the hollowing out of the physical killing of priests and such. But I did see a statistic that somewhere in the order of 19,000 government bureaucrats and functionaries were killed between I think it was 1904 and 1917. So there is just a constant attrition as well of some of the best and brightest that and potentially the most loyal that the government was able to put forward. So by the time you get to 1917, if you're seeing accusations flying around of corruption, incompetence, and all that kind of thing amongst the bureaucrats and the bureaucracy in general, and all the state officials, then maybe there's a good reason for that.
And again, this is just to reinforce my contention that this has already again happened during the reign of Nicholas II. Again, I really do feel that Russia was completely rudderless by 1917, which again, more than any ideological impetus, was the reason why so many sectors of Russian society were all united around getting rid of him. It was what to replace him with, which of course was the long-awaited the question, which had no answer effectively. Instead, the answer was imposed by someone that no one in 1917 could ever imagine, which of course was Lenin. Marcus58.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I just chime in there quickly? Which actually plays in part. How I was sort of saying that one side was you use the word rudderless, which is actually a very good word to use, but were aimless, and well, not aimless, but they were sort of disorganized and a bit disoriented. Whereas the Bolsheviks were focused and disciplined and functioned almost like this slick machine, and Lenin made them that way essentially. You actually just, that last comment you made sort of harkened to that exactly. That a part of what I was trying to sort of get at too was was exactly the fact that the aims, from whether it was the leading generals like Kolchak or Denikin or Miller or whoever or Wrangel, they may have even within themselves had differing objectives or different visions of what a post-white victory Russia would look like and how it would function, and indeed the individual relationship for themselves, because they would have considered themselves Russian loyalists. But as we've talked about in the stream, actually mostly you two, not so much myself, but they had sort of come to accept the fait accompli of the Romanovs having been deposed, certainly as supreme rulers and autocrats of the Russian state. And I think that probably exacerbated the problem of the disorganization of the whites and not having focus and energy in a particular direction, whereas the Reds absolutely, the Bolsheviks, even though they were sort of creating something anew, I think Lenin had formed the movement and the party with such rigor and such great, mental clarity and with such drive and discipline that even though they were sort of creating something from nothing, they knew what they wanted to do. They knew what they wanted to achieve objectively. They had that focus, that aspiration that was not ambiguous.
But it's
and
not
I think
just,
that contributed to that to some degree.
But again, it's not just the aspiration, it's also the willingness to do anything and say anything to attain power and then implement the plan and sustain themselves in power by using every and all means at their disposal to the maintenance of this plan. So how does Lenin get any support in St. Petersburg, Petrograd? It's not because he comes in with a radical plan to launch the International Socialist Revolution. It is because he promises peace and bread.
Yes.
Well, it also helps that he hadn't alienated all of his potential allies by that point, like almost every other faction that he was putting himself up against.
So Marcus, you're going to. I'm sure this might have been paid, and Marcus 58 is actually your alter ego. Given you guys were forced to largely gloss over it, might you someday consider a special episode on the rise and fall of the Komnenoi?
Well, that's up to you. I think you know what my answer already is. I mean, I know we have had to cram an awful lot into these episodes over the months and indeed years that this has turned out to be. But I do think that you know I was almost at pains to read that excerpt about how wonderful John II was, and you think about it too that that dynasty was responsible for probably continuing, you know, Greco-Anatolian civilization and you know Greek Orthodox civilization in the Aegean region for at least another couple of centuries. And I sadly think that we kind of didn't get the time to really give it the attention it deserves. But I mean, this is your channel. It's up to you. Actually, I was going to say, I believe potentially a compatriot of mine from university, but yeah, that's up to you. And maybe we'll have to discuss this in DMs in due course.
Well, as you can probably tell, I'm a latecomer to medieval history. My main area is early modern through to the First World War. That's my comparative wheelhouse, so to speak. But as you can tell by all the streams we've done, I'm interested in everywhere and every time, so to speak. So maybe at some time we'll do an entire episode dedicated to John II. I'm sure if I suggested that, you would you may be enticed to come on. Maybe
I would
not.
walk on nails for it.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for those super chats. So, Marcus, anything you would like to say before we get out of here?
I already kind of half said my outro about you know the overarching you know journey that's been OAN.
No, I
mean
in terms of like shilling.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to say on that basis, it's just been great anyway, and I'm glad everyone has stuck with us. But in terms of shilling, I believe actually I just got messaged just before I started streaming. I think Charlemagne and Prudentialists have something brewing about you know like the idea of wargaming. And when I say wargaming, not as in video games, but as in you know the military planning and using war games to sort of test military theory and technologies. I think so. I've been summoned to do that. That might happen in a couple of days, and I will be. Actually, sorry, I misled everyone when I said a few days ago that I was streaming with Hitman this coming weekend. No, it's actually this coming Wednesday. It is 7 days from now that Hitman and I will be discussing Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck's Reminiscences of Africa, which should be a wonderful stream because that's actually one of the highlights of the 20th century. When I talk about great adventures of the 20th century, I mentioned the Czech Legion and how that was quite the story. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's adventures in Tanganyika probably rates up there as well. So please stick around for that. And of course, Hitman is another contributor to this channel and he's definitely worth following and supporting. So jump over there and do so. But other than that, thank you, AM. Lovely to cap off this series in such a way with such wonderful guests and with Rupert on board once more. And yeah, no, thank you, everyone. And well, from down under, it'll be good morning now. So hope everyone has a good night.
And I watched that with intense interest, because obviously it's an area of history which I'm very intrigued by, but know absolutely nothing about. So I look forward to that. Rupert, anything you would like to shill before we get out of here?
Yes. So in 2 days' time, on Friday, I should have a stream with Iron Duke over on his channel about the English yeoman, both in mythology and in history. If you've been interested by this period, then there's a load of threads on particular sort of niche topics around this time period over on my Twitter page, which is the same as my name here. So I can be found there. And seeing as we've mentioned him a few times already, there might just be a translation into English of Lev Tikhomirov's magnum opus coming at some point in the future.
Sorry, I've just noticed. No. And thank you for all of those contributions, Rupert. Sorry, I'm as you can probably tell, I'm very tired at the end of a nearly 4-hour stream. All right, I've got to remember certain things. A lot of people have been asking about how channel memberships work and exactly where content is segregated on this channel. There are various tiers of membership. I'm grateful for all people who become members, by the way. It really does help and facilitate the work of this channel. At pleb tier, people gain access to all episodes in the mainstream series, the Politeia thing, Nations of Charlemagne, Brief History of Europe, and now Orthodoxy, Autocracy, and Nationality, because I will start to put part 2s of this series behind a paywall. You also get access to a few alternative history episodes on that tier. At the next tier, which is Equestrian tier, and also it should be noted that this is one of the few places where you become a paid up member and you get insulted for the privilege. So if you want to ascend from plebdom and to become a elite tier member, by becoming an equestrian member, you will gain access to every episode of Heterodox, which is the random sort of history segment which covers anything and everything. If you want access to everything on the channel, you need to become a patrician tier, and of course the other tiers are for those who really want to contribute more to the channel. So just to clarify that. Other than that, I want to say thank you for everyone who has donated a super chat. Thank you to my 2 wonderful guests for making this episode, and indeed Marcus in particular for making this series possible. And special commendations to Mr. Patriarch, to Columba, to Hitman, and everyone else, and Semigog in particular, and everyone else, indeed Semigog going back to our earlier streams on Turkish history. Everyone who has contributed to the series over the years, literal years that have gone into making it. So thank you everyone so much for listening, and good night.